Who would destroy a woman's only beautiful dress, and why did they choose the one night Robert Langley refused to look away? Black harness stain dripped from Martha Bennett's blue wool skirt as laughter slipped through the barn. A deliberate cut split the hem her mother had sewn. Then heavy boots struck the floor behind her. The room fell silent. Martha turned and saw the giant cowboy coming toward her. What would you do in her place? Stay with us. The freight wagon left Martha Bennett in Dry Creek just after 4 on a hot August afternoon. It left her with one brown trunk, $12.40 sewn into the lining of her purse, and a folded letter she had read so many times the creases had begun to tear. Martha stood beside the road while the wagon rolled east in a cloud of pale dust. Dry Creek, Montana Territory, was smaller than she had imagined. A row of false front buildings faced a wide dirt street cut with wagon ruts. Horses stood under hitching rails, with their heads hanging against the heat. Somewhere behind the hotel, a blacksmith's hammer struck iron in a steady rhythm. The air smelled of dust, horse sweat, pine smoke, and coffee drifting from an open kitchen window. Nobody came to meet her. That wasn't surprising. Nobody knew she was coming except George Parker. Martha bent, caught both handles of her trunk, and lifted. A man outside the mercantile watched her struggle with it. He didn't offer to help. His eyes traveled over her instead. Martha knew that look. At 31, she had learned there were people who could decide what they thought of her before she spoke a single word. They saw a large woman with broad hips, heavy arms, a round face browned by travel, and a plain gray dress stretched over a body. Fashionable clothes had never been designed to flatter. They rarely looked long enough to notice her hands. That was their mistake. Those hands could saddle-stitch wet leather without puckering it. They could replace a broken trace, patch a wagon cover in a crosswind, keep a column of figures straight, and find weak thread by touch alone. Martha shifted the trunk against her leg and started down the street. The sign she wanted hung above a narrow storefront near the freight yard. Dry Creek Harness and Freight Supply. George Parker, proprietor, a brass bell, gave a tired jingle when she entered. Harnesses hung from ceiling beams. Coiled reins filled one wall. Buckles, rivets, awls, punches, waxed thread, and leather scraps covered a long workbench beneath the front window. An older man with iron-gray hair looked up from a saddle. "Martha Bennett?" She set down the trunk. "Yes, sir." George Parker wiped his hands on his apron. For half a second, his expression changed. It was slight. Martha had become good at noticing slight things. Then he smiled. "Your letter said you worked freight repair." 7 years. Heavy canvas? Yes. Team harness? Yes. Saddle skirts? If the tree isn't broken. George looked at her hands. That was better. He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a cracked breast strap. "Show me." Martha removed her traveling gloves. She turned the strap beneath the window, flexed the leather, checked the old stitching, then picked up one of George's awls. "This shouldn't be patched." George raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" She bent the strap backward. A narrow fracture opened near the buckle fold. "Leather's gone dry through the center. Stitch it, and it'll look repaired until somebody puts weight against it. Then it'll tear beside the new seam." George took the strap. He examined the crack. Martha waited. Finally, he nodded toward the second bench. "Sit down." That was how she got the job. Not warmly, but honestly enough. For the first 2 days, Martha worked beside the front window. George paid her 75 cents a day while he tested what she could do. She repaired 2 wagon covers, replaced stitching on a set of traces, restitched the skirt of a stock saddle, and found $3.20 missing from a freight invoice because someone had carried a 7 into the wrong column. George stared at the corrected figures. You do accounts, too? My stepfather hated numbers. And you didn't? Numbers don't care who's holding the pencil. George almost smiled. The trouble wasn't the work. It was the customers. On her third morning, a rancher's wife entered with a riding bridle. She stopped when she saw Martha behind the bench. Who is she? Mrs. Bennett's doing repair work, George said. Miss Bennett? The woman glanced at Martha. She's working here? For now. The woman hesitated before placing the bridle on the counter. I'd rather you did it. George rubbed his jaw. I'm 3 days behind. I can wait. The same thing happened that afternoon. Then again the next morning. Some people merely stared. Others lowered their voices, though not enough. One man made a joke about whether George had reinforced the stool beneath Martha's bench. Martha kept sewing. The needle went through. The thread pulled tight. Again. 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 At closing time, George locked the front door but didn't turn the sign. He stood with his hands on his hips. Martha. She already knew. How much am I losing you? George looked uncomfortable. That's not what I was going to say. It was close. He exhaled through his nose. Come here. Behind the main shop was a narrow storage room with a small window facing the alley. Shelves held harness oil, spare hardware, canvas rolls, and boxes of rivets. George had cleared one corner. A workbench stood there. Martha looked at it, then at him. You want me in the back. I want you employed. The words landed harder because he wasn't cruel when he said them. George rubbed a thumb across a stain on his apron. You're the best stitcher I've had in years, but if people stop bringing work through that door, neither of us gets paid. Martha looked through the open doorway toward the bright front room. Same wages? Same wages. Same work? More, probably. She carried her tools into the back. That evening, Susan Bell found her eating bread and cold beans alone at the boarding house kitchen table. Susan was 49, narrow-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and ran her house with a ring of keys tied to her apron. You look like somebody buried your dog, she said. I never had a dog. Then somebody buried something else. Martha tore another piece of bread. George moved me into the back room. Susan stopped wiping the stove. Because of your work? No. Susan understood. She didn't offer pity. Martha appreciated that. Instead, Susan poured coffee into a chipped white mug and set it beside her. Rent's due Monday. Martha looked up. Susan's mouth twitched. I'm sympathetic, not charitable. A small laugh escaped Martha before she could stop it. Monday, she promised. Life settled into a narrow shape after that. Boarding house, harness shop, back room. Boarding house again. Martha began arriving before George. She opened the rear shutters for light, sharpened the awls, warmed stiff leather near the stove on cool mornings, and arranged each job according to urgency. People stopped seeing her. Her work kept appearing. A repaired saddle would be waiting at the counter. A wagon sheet would come back watertight. A teamster would complain about the price, then return 2 days later because Martha's stitching had held where another man's had failed. George stopped checking everything she finished. By the second week, he simply carried damaged gear through the curtain and placed it on her bench. One afternoon, he brought his account ledger too. Something's wrong. Martha found it before supper. 2 freight charges had been entered twice. George had overpaid a supplier by $11. He stared at the figures, then at her. Remind me never to cheat you. I would notice. I believe you. Late in September, a shadow filled the doorway between the shop and the back room. Martha looked up. For one startled moment, she thought the doorway had somehow become smaller. The man standing there was enormous. He had to lower his head beneath the frame. His shoulders nearly touched both sides. Dust covered his boots to the ankles, and his dark work shirt was faded across the shoulders from sun and weather. George came behind him carrying a heavy team harness. Robert Langley, Stone Ridge. Martha knew the name. Everybody in Dry Creek did. Stone Ridge Ranch lay about 10 miles west of town, beyond the cottonwoods and low foothills climbing toward the crazy mountains. Robert Langley owned most of the cattle grazing that country. He was 42, unmarried, and according to Susan Bell, capable of making an entire table quiet simply by sitting down. George dropped the harness on Martha's bench. "Trace tore loose yesterday." Robert said nothing. Martha turned the harness over. The visible damage was ordinary. She ran her thumb beneath the doubled leather, then stopped. "Mr. Parker." George had started toward the front. He turned. "What?" "Bring me the lamp." Robert's eyes shifted toward her hands. George brought the lamp. Martha angled the light beneath the strap and pushed the leather apart with the blunt end of her awl. A thin split appeared deep inside the fold. This wasn't the failure. George leaned closer. Martha pointed. This was. Robert stepped forward. The room seemed to lose another foot of space. Martha expected herself to move back. She didn't. "Explain," he said. His voice was low and rough. She showed him the hidden fracture. The outer stitching tore because this section had already weakened underneath. Whoever repaired it last time stitched over the visible wear and never opened the fold. Robert touched the split with one thick finger. What would have happened? Depends what you hitched it to. Freight wagon. Loaded. Martha looked up at him. Then you were lucky. His eyes stayed on hers. How lucky? On level ground, you might have stopped it. And downhill? She paused. You might not have stopped anything. Silence filled the back room. George muttered something under his breath. Robert lifted the harness and examined the place she had shown him. Then he looked at Martha again. Not at her waist, not at the chair, not at the shape of her dress, at her hands. The calluses along her fingers, the wax caught beneath one thumbnail, the small scar across her knuckle from an old harness knife. Can you fix it? He asked. I can replace the weakened section. How long? Tomorrow afternoon. George spoke quickly. I've got other work ahead of... Tomorrow afternoon, Martha repeated. Robert looked at George. She said tomorrow. George closed his mouth. Robert reached into his coat, put a deposit on the bench, and turned toward the front. At the curtain, he stopped. I've got 6 more sets at Stone Ridge. George nodded. Bring them in. Robert glanced back at Martha. Have her do the rest of mine. Then he left. Martha sat very still. From the front room came the bell above the door, followed by the fading sound of Robert's boots on the boardwalk. George looked at her. Well, Martha picked up the harness. It's just work. Didn't say otherwise. But George was smiling when he returned to the counter. Martha bent over the damaged leather and threaded her needle. Outside the little rear window, 2 women had stopped in the alley. One whispered something. The other leaned sideways, trying to see through the glass. Martha lowered her eyes to the harness. For weeks, Dry Creek had treated her as though being hidden away was the natural order of things. Robert Langley had walked into the back room and, without raising his voice, made her work worth asking for by name. And by sundown, half the town would know it. By the next morning, Martha knew exactly how fast news traveled in Dry Creek. She had barely taken off her coat when George Parker came through the curtain carrying a bundle of reins. "Mrs. Bell says Langley asked for you." Martha set her sewing roll on the bench. "He asked for the repair." George gave her a look. "That isn't how Susan told it." Martha ignored him and reached for the reins. The first Stone Ridge harness was finished shortly after noon. She had cut out the weakened leather entirely, fitted a new section, beveled the edges, punched fresh holes, and stitched it with waxed linen thread strong enough to hold under wagon strain. She rubbed the finished leather with a little tallow until the repair darkened to match the old strap. Robert came for it himself. Martha heard him before she saw him. The front door opened. The floorboards gave two slow complaints beneath heavy boots. George stopped talking. A moment later, Robert ducked beneath the curtain. He held the repaired harness up and bent the leather at the seam. His large hands moved carefully, not testing Martha so much as testing the work. "That's cleaner than the original stitching." Martha looked down at the strap. The original was rushed. "Can you tell who did it?" "No." "Wouldn't matter if you could. I'm the one who kept using it." He set the harness down. Martha hadn't expected that answer. Most men she had known found someone else to blame before they found a mirror. Robert reached into his coat and placed the balance of the payment on the bench. Then another $2. Martha frowned. "That's too much. 6 more sets are coming tomorrow, then you can pay tomorrow. That's for the one that didn't break." She pushed one coin toward him. The agreed price was $1.50. Robert looked at the coin, then at her, so it was. He took it back. Martha had the strange impression that she had passed another test neither of them had announced. The next day, a Stone Ridge ranch hand arrived with the 6 harness sets loaded across a pack horse. Robert came an hour later. He claimed he had business at the freight office. George didn't ask why the freight office apparently required him to spend 15 minutes in Martha's back room discussing buckles. The first few visits remained like that. Practical. Ordinary. At least that was what Martha told herself. Robert would set some piece of equipment on her bench. "This ring keeps twisting. The leather's stretched. Can you shorten it?" "Yes." Or, "This saddle skirt rides wrong. Trees sound. I checked it. I'll check it again." He never seemed offended. Sometimes he stood in silence while she worked, one shoulder against the doorframe, his hat turning slowly between his hands. Martha became aware of small things. He always removed his hat indoors. He never interrupted when she was counting stitches. He drank his coffee black. He carried a narrow pencil in the same breast pocket every day, sharpened with a knife rather than a proper cutter. And when Martha spoke, Robert looked directly at her. At first, she found that more difficult than being ignored. One Thursday, she was reinforcing a breast collar when he appeared without announcing himself. "You cut that crooked." Martha looked up. "I did not." Robert pointed. "That edge." She stared at him, then at the leather. "It follows the old line. Old line's crooked." Martha examined it. He was right. She hated that. Robert saw something in her face. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Martha picked up her knife. "You could have kept that to yourself. Would have made the harness crooked. It was already crooked. So fix it." She cut the edge again. When she looked up, he was still almost smiling. That evening, Susan Bell placed stew in front of Martha and sat across from her with her own bowl. Langley was at Parker's again. Martha reached for the salt. Stone Ridge has harness, apparently enough to outfit the United States cavalry. Susan. I'm only observing. You observe too much. That's how I keep a boarding house. Martha ate 3 spoonfuls before Susan spoke again. Virginia Hale has noticed too. That made Martha pause. Virginia Hale was the sort of woman Martha had learned to recognize from a distance. 27, slender, always dressed in clothes that fit perfectly, the only daughter of Albert Hale, one of the largest cattle buyers in the county. Martha had seen her twice. Both times, Virginia had looked at her with the polite blankness reserved for servants and badly placed furniture. What does that have to do with me? Susan broke a biscuit in half. Probably nothing. Martha waited. Susan dipped the biscuit into her stew. Which is why I thought you should know. 2 days later, Martha discovered how Dry Creek had chosen to interpret Robert's visits. A freight contractor named Ed Morris came into Parker's shop shortly before noon. Martha could hear him from the back room. Langley here again? George answered without enthusiasm. Yesterday. Morris laughed. Must be some powerful, complicated leather. George said nothing. Morris lowered his voice, though not enough. I suppose a man his size needs a stronger chair if he's planning on spending that much time with the woman you've got hidden back there. A second man laughed. Martha's needle stopped halfway through the leather. She waited for George. Nothing. Not because George agreed. Because George had customers. Because customers paid bills. Martha lowered her eyes and pulled the stitch through. Then the front door opened. No bell sounded. George had removed it for repair that morning. The laughter ended anyway. Robert's voice came from the front. What chair? Nobody answered. Martha went still. Morris cleared his throat. Nothing, Langley. Just talking. About? George said quietly. Robert. But Robert wasn't looking at him. Morris tried to smile. Didn't mean anything by it. Robert stepped farther into the shop. Martha could see part of him through the curtain now. Dark shirt, broad shoulder, one hand resting loosely beside his gun belt. He wasn't threatening anyone. That almost made it worse. You haul Stone Ridge freight twice a month, Robert said. Morris's smile faded. Usually. Not anymore. The room went silent. Morris blinked. Now hold on. Send the September invoices to Stone Ridge. I'll settle what's owed. Over a joke? Robert picked up a coil of reins from the counter and examined them as though the conversation had already ended. I don't pay men who insult people working for me. Martha's hand tightened around the needle. People working for me. He had said it as though her work mattered more than whatever joke had been made about her. Morris's face darkened. You think you'll find cheaper hauling? Didn't say cheaper. Robert set the reins down. I said different. Morris left without buying anything. His boots struck the boardwalk hard enough for Martha to hear them through the wall. A few seconds later, George pushed through the curtain. He looked at Martha. She kept sewing. Don't. George stopped. Don't what? Tell me about it. He canceled Morris. I heard. Cost him money. Martha pulled another stitch tight. That was his decision. George leaned one shoulder against the wall. You going to thank him? No. Why? Because then he'd think I needed it done. George studied her, then nodded once and returned to the counter. Robert appeared in the doorway several minutes later. Martha did not look up. You heard. Dry Creek walls aren't particularly thick. He stepped inside. If that caused trouble for you, it didn't. Martha finally raised her eyes. Robert was watching her carefully. She put down the harness. You didn't have to do that. I know. Then why did you? He considered the question. Outside, a wagon rolled past, iron rims grinding over packed dirt. Robert looked toward the sound, then back at her. I meant what I said. Martha waited. I don't pay men who insult people working for me. That could become expensive. It won't. How do you know? Most men learn faster when money's involved. Martha tried not to smile. She failed. Only slightly. Robert noticed. He looked away first. That surprised her more than anything. After that, his visits changed. Not enough for anyone to name it. Enough for Martha to notice. He began bringing his own damaged tack instead of sending a hand. Once he arrived with a buckle so easily repaired, she finished it before he had taken off his gloves. Another time he brought a saddlebag with one loose seam. Martha held it up. This is all? That's all? You rode 10 miles for one seam? I had business in town. What business? Robert looked toward the front room. Coffee. Martha stared at him. George made a choking sound from behind the curtain. Robert's expression remained perfectly serious. Martha repaired the seam. He stayed until she finished. On the first cold morning of September, frost silvered the edges of the hitching rails. Martha arrived at the shop with numb fingers and found a tin cup sitting beside her bench. Steam rose from it. George was sorting receipts in front. Did you make this? No. Martha looked toward the rear door. George didn't turn around. Langley stopped by early. Said he'd forgotten something. What? Apparently coffee? Martha wrapped both hands around the cup. It was black, too strong, and still hot. She drank it anyway. By then, people no longer pretended not to notice. Women lingered at Parker's front window. Ranch hands found excuses to walk past the alley. Virginia Hale came into the shop one afternoon for a new riding crop she plainly did not need. Martha was carrying a repaired bridle through the curtain when Virginia saw her. Their eyes met. Virginia smiled pleasantly. Martha Bennett, isn't it? Yes. I've heard your work is very good. Thank you. Virginia's gaze moved briefly toward the back room. Mr. Langley certainly seems to think so. Martha felt the meaning beneath the words. She held Virginia's eyes. He pays his bills on time. That makes him an excellent customer. Virginia's smile remained. Of course. She bought the riding crop and left. Through the window, Martha watched her cross the street and climb into a polished buggy bearing the Hale brand. George came beside her. That went well. Did it? No. Martha returned to the back room. Robert came in shortly before closing. He had no harness, no bridle, no saddlebag. For the first time, he had apparently come without a reason. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand. Martha waited. Robert looked toward the half-finished work on her bench, then at her. George says you're working late. George talks too much. That's true. Silence settled. Martha threaded a needle. Robert still didn't leave. Finally, she said, Did something need repairing? No. Then what do you need? His fingers tightened once around the brim of his hat. Nothing dramatic. Just enough for her to see. Nothing tonight. He nodded toward her work. Good night, Martha. Good night, Mr. Langley. Robert. She looked up. He stood there a second longer. People I know call me Robert. Then he ducked beneath the doorway and walked out into the cold evening. Martha sat with the needle motionless between her fingers. From the front of the shop, George began whistling. Don't, Martha called. The whistling stopped. For perhaps 3 seconds, then started again. Outside, the lamps along Dry Creek were being lit one by one, and across the street, behind the glass of Hale Mercantile's carriage window, Virginia Hale watched Robert Langley walk away from Parker's shop alone. Martha knew nothing about that. She stayed another half-hour in the back room, finishing a saddle skirt under the yellow light of an oil lamp, while George counted the day's receipts at the front counter. When she finally returned to Susan Bell's boarding house, the supper dishes had already been cleared. Susan sat near the stove darning a stocking. "You missed stew. I wasn't hungry." "That's a lie." Susan pointed toward a covered plate beside the stove. Martha removed her coat. There were potatoes, a slice of beef, and 2 biscuits kept warm beneath an overturned tin pan. She sat down. Susan stitched another 3 inches before speaking. "Harvest supper's next Saturday." Martha cut into the potatoes. "I heard. You going?" "No." Susan didn't look up. "Why?" "Because I don't dance. You don't have to. I don't enjoy crowds. Neither do half the people who go." Martha took a bite. Susan pulled the thread tight. "Reverend Warren says they're using the old livestock barn again. Albert Hale donated lantern oil. Mrs. Cooper's making pies. George Parker already bought 2 tickets." Martha looked at her. "Did George ask you to bother me?" "No. I bother people for free." Martha almost smiled. Susan set the stocking in her lap. "You've been in Dry Creek nearly a month. You go from this house to that back room and from that back room to this house. That's not much of a life. It's enough. Enough and good aren't always the same thing." Martha's fork slowed. Susan saw it and softened her voice. "I have a dress you could borrow." "No." "Brown silk. Might need letting out." I said no. Susan studied her. Martha lowered her eyes to the plate. After a moment, Susan picked up the stocking again. "All right." The matter should have ended there. It did not. 2 nights later, Susan found Martha sitting on the floor beside her open trunk. The boarding house room was scarcely wide enough for the bed, washstand, trunk, and 1 straight-backed chair. Rain tapped lightly against the window. A lamp burned low on the washstand. Martha had removed nearly everything from the trunk: 2 work dresses, 3 blouses, a folded shawl, a Bible with a cracked leather cover, a small wooden sewing box, and beneath all of it, wrapped in white cotton, lay a dark blue dress. Susan stopped in the doorway. "Oh." Martha looked up. I couldn't sleep." Susan stepped inside without asking. The dress was made of good wool, not fashionable enough for Helena or St. Louis, but far finer than anything Martha wore in Dry Creek. Small pearl-colored buttons ran down the front. The skirt was full enough to move easily, and the lining had been stitched by hand. Susan touched the sleeve. "You made this?" "My mother started it." Martha ran her thumb over one seam. She cut the bodice. "Did most of the lining. Then she got sick." Susan sat on the chair. "And you finished it?" "After." Martha said nothing more. She didn't need to. Susan examined the waist. "When did you last wear it?" "Never." Susan looked at her. Martha folded one side carefully over the other. "It was supposed to be for church. Or Christmas. Something worth dressing for. And nothing ever was?" Martha gave a small shrug. Susan's eyes rested on her for a moment. Then she reached for the dress. "Stand up." Martha frowned. "Susan, stand. I am not going to that supper. I didn't say you were. You are measuring the dress. I'm curious." "About what?" "Whether your mother knew what she was doing." Martha stared at her. Susan waited. At last Martha stood. The dress still fit, mostly. The waist needed easing. One sleeve pulled slightly across Martha's upper arm, and the hem had come loose near the left side. Susan walked around her slowly. Your mother knew exactly what she was doing. Martha looked toward the small mirror above the washstand. She barely recognized the woman in it. The blue softened something about her face. Or perhaps it only made her notice herself differently. She reached instinctively toward the buttons. Susan caught her wrist. Leave it. It pulls here. Barely. It makes me look larger. Susan's expression changed. Then what? Martha said nothing. Susan let go of her wrist. You've spent years listening to people who think a woman's first duty is to take up as little room as possible. She straightened the shoulder seam. Let them be disappointed. Martha looked at the mirror again. The next evening, they altered the dress at the kitchen table after supper. Susan opened the side seams while Martha adjusted the sleeves. They worked beneath 2 lamps, pushing plates and coffee mugs aside as thread, pins, chalk, and fabric slowly took over the table. Near the hem, Martha found one loose section of old stitching. She stopped. Susan noticed. Want me to redo it? No. Martha turned the fabric over. The stitches were smaller than her own and slightly uneven. Her mother's work. She threaded a needle and carefully repaired around the loose section without cutting the original thread. Susan watched but said nothing. That silence was one of the reasons Martha had come to trust her. By Thursday, the dress was nearly finished. Martha stood in Susan's room because it had the larger mirror, turning slightly to check the side seam. Susan adjusted the back. There. Martha ran both hands down the skirt. This is foolish. Probably. People will stare. They already stare. That's supposed to help? No. Susan stepped back. But if they're going to look anyway, you might as well wear blue. A knock sounded downstairs. Susan frowned. Who comes calling this late? I'll change. Stay there. I'll see who it is. Susan left. Martha began reaching for the buttons. Then she heard a man's voice below. Low. Familiar. Her hands stopped. A moment later, Susan appeared at the top of the stairs. Behind her stood Robert Langley. He had removed his hat, and he seemed even larger inside the narrow boarding house hall than he had in George's back room. Martha stared at him. Robert stared at Martha. Neither spoke. Susan's eyes moved from one to the other. I'll be downstairs. She disappeared before Martha could stop her. Robert remained at the threshold. He held a small leather-bound notebook in one hand. Martha recognized it. Her measuring book. You left this at Parker's. Oh. Robert extended it. Martha crossed the room to take it. His hand remained out for half a second after she had the book. Then he seemed to remember himself and lowered it. George said you'd need it tomorrow. Thank you. Robert nodded. He still hadn't left. Martha became painfully aware of the dress again. She resisted the urge to fold her arms across herself. Was there something else? Robert looked toward the window, then the washstand, then finally back at her. No. A long silence. Martha's face warmed. I know it isn't fashionable. Robert's brow tightened. What? The dress. He looked at it again. Not quickly. Not carelessly. His gaze settled on the sleeves Susan had altered, then the dark blue skirt, then Martha's face. I wasn't thinking that. What were you thinking? Robert opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time since Martha had known him, the man who always seemed to possess exactly as many words as he needed had none. He looked almost irritated by the discovery. Martha lowered her eyes. I was considering changing the trim. Don't. She looked up. Robert's voice had come faster than usual. He cleared his throat. Don't change it. Martha's fingers tightened around the measuring book. You think it's all right? Robert's eyes met hers. Yes. One word. Simple. Certain. It did more damage to Martha's careful composure than any elaborate compliment could have. Robert seemed to realize he had stayed too long. He stepped backward into the hall. Good night, Martha. Good night, Robert. He paused at hearing his first name. Then he put on his hat and went downstairs. Martha remained beside the doorway, listening until the front door closed. Susan reappeared almost immediately. She leaned against the frame. Not fashionable, was it? Martha gave her a warning look. Susan's mouth curved. I didn't say anything. You were about to. Probably. Martha returned to the mirror. The woman in blue was still there. But now Martha didn't immediately search for everything wrong with her. She touched the dark wool at her waist, then the repaired stitches near the hem. Across the street, Robert stepped from the boarding house into the cool September evening. A buggy stood outside Hale Mercantile. Virginia Hale sat beneath its raised leather top with gloved hands folded over her lap. Robert tipped his hat as he passed. Evening, Miss Hale. Mr. Langley. Her smile was perfect. Robert continued toward his horse. Virginia watched him mount. Then she lifted her eyes toward the second-floor window of Susan Bell's boarding house. Behind the glass, Martha's blue dress moved briefly through the lamplight. Virginia's smile disappeared. By the time Robert rode west toward Stone Ridge, she was still sitting there. Saturday came bright and cold. A hard September wind had blown through Dry Creek overnight, clearing the dust from the sky and leaving the crazy mountains sharp against the western horizon. Frost silvered the shaded edges of the boardwalk until the sun reached them. Martha spent most of the morning telling herself she was not going to the harvest supper. By noon, Susan Bell had laid the blue dress across Martha's bed. By 3, she had heated 2 pressing irons on the kitchen stove. By 5, Martha was standing in front of the narrow mirror, while Susan fastened the last pearl-colored button. This is a mistake, Martha said. Susan smoothed the left sleeve. You've said that 6 times. 7. Then we've established your position. Martha looked at herself. The dark blue wool fitted her properly now. Not tightly, not loosely enough to disguise her shape. Her mother's stitching remained hidden near the lower hem, preserved exactly where Martha had repaired around it. Susan stepped behind her and pinned one loose strand of brown hair. Martha reached toward it. Susan slapped her hand away. Leave something alone for once. I look too dressed up. For a supper, for me. Susan's hands went still. She met Martha's eyes in the mirror. That's a poor habit. What is? Thinking good things belong more naturally to somebody else. Martha looked down. Susan picked up the dark shawl lying across the bed and placed it over Martha's shoulders. There. Now stop arguing with a woman who controls your breakfast. The old livestock barn stood at the south end of Dry Creek beyond the freight sheds. By the time Martha and Susan arrived, lanterns hung from roof beams and fence posts, throwing gold light across rough plank walls. Reverend Joseph Warren had persuaded several ranch families to scrub the place clean, though nothing could completely remove the smell of hay, leather, cattle, and old timber. Long tables ran along one wall: roast beef, potatoes, beans, cornbread, apple preserves, 3 kinds of pie. A fiddle player tuned near the open center floor while cowboys carried benches into rows. People were laughing when Martha entered. Then some of them stopped. Not everyone. Enough, She felt the change before she looked around. A woman near the pie table glanced toward Martha's dress, then whispered to the woman beside her. Two young men by the barn doors looked over and quickly turned away, both smiling into their coffee. Martha's hand tightened around the edge of her shawl. Susan moved closer. "Keep walking." "I am. You're standing still." Martha realized she was. She took another step, then another. George Parker waved from a table near the wall. "Over here." Relief loosened something in her chest. She and Susan crossed toward him. George had saved one chair. For Susan. Martha noticed before anyone said it. George noticed too. His expression changed. "I thought there'd be another." "It's all right," Martha said quickly. "There are chairs somewhere." Susan turned. Most were occupied. A few had coats or hats placed over them. Men sat shoulder to shoulder with wives and daughters. Nobody moved anything. Martha could feel the room deciding whether to see her. She wanted to leave. Not dramatically. She simply wanted to walk back through the barn doors, cross the darkening street, climb the boarding house stairs, remove the blue dress, fold it carefully, and never make the mistake of believing clothing could change anything again. Then a chair scraped across the floor. The sound carried farther than it should have. Martha looked toward the center of the barn. Robert Langley had risen from a table with 4 Stone Ridge ranch hands. He wore a clean black coat over a white shirt, though the collar sat awkwardly against a neck accustomed to work clothes. At 6'7", he stood above nearly everyone around him. He pulled an empty chair away from the table. Not halfway, all the way. Then he looked at Martha. Martha, that was all. No explanation, no performance, just her name. The room seemed to become very quiet. Martha looked at Susan. Susan raised one eyebrow. "Go." Martha crossed the barn. Robert waited until she reached the table before setting the chair beside his. "Thank you," he nodded. Peter Wallace, a young Stone Ridge hand seated across from them, immediately moved his elbows off the table. Another man shifted the bread basket toward Martha. Robert sat, and somehow that was the end of it. Or at least Robert behaved as though it was. For the first several minutes, Martha barely tasted her supper. She was too aware of everything. The blue wool against her wrists. Robert's black sleeve beside hers. People looking. The fiddle beginning a slow tune. A spoon knocking against a tin cup somewhere behind her. Peter asked whether George had repaired the brown mare's driving harness. Martha answered before Robert could. "It'll be ready Tuesday if the new buckle arrives Monday." Peter looked surprised. "You working on it?" "Yes." "Good." He took another bite. Martha waited for the joke. None came. A ranch hand named Samuel Green asked her whether doubled stitching held better in winter. Martha explained that it depended on where the leather flexed. Robert listened while she spoke. Not politely. Closely. Soon Martha realized she had stopped thinking about how she was sitting. Someone passed her potatoes. Robert refilled her coffee without asking. When she reached for the cream pitcher at the same moment he did, their hands nearly touched. Both stopped. Robert withdrew his first. Martha poured cream into her cup. "Thank you." His ears looked slightly red. Martha lowered her eyes before he could see her smile. For almost an hour, Dry Creek became something she had not expected it could be. Ordinary. She ate. She talked. She laughed once when Peter told a story about a Stone Ridge colt that had escaped a corral and walked straight into Robert's kitchen. Robert denied the horse had reached the kitchen. Peter insisted there had been hoof prints beside the stove. "They were mine." "Your boots aren't round, boss." Robert gave him a long look. Peter grinned into his plate. Martha laughed again. Robert looked at her. The laughter faded, but his eyes remained on her a moment longer than necessary. Then a woman's voice came from behind him. "Robert!" Virginia Hale stood at the end of the table. She wore dark green silk trimmed with black velvet. Her pale gloves were spotless. Her hair had been arranged so carefully that not even the evening wind seemed capable of disturbing it. Albert Hale stood several feet behind her, speaking with Reverend Warren. Virginia smiled at the ranch hands, then at Martha. "Miss Bennett, Miss Hale." Robert rose because Virginia was standing. "Evening, Virginia. I wondered whether you'd come. I usually do. Not every year." "No." Virginia rested one hand on the back of an empty chair at the next table. "My father was hoping to discuss the October cattle purchase with you. Monday will do, of course." She glanced toward Martha. "Only once." Then back at Robert. "Father was also remembering something your father used to say." Robert's expression remained neutral. That could be almost anything. Virginia smiled. About the Hale and Langley interests belonging together one day. Peter stopped chewing. Martha looked at her coffee. Virginia continued pleasantly. "Two established families, good land, good stock, sensible arrangements have built more than one successful ranch." Robert slowly picked up his cup. "My father said plenty after whiskey." One of the ranch hands coughed into his fist. Virginia's smile tightened. It wasn't only business he had in mind. Now Martha understood. So did everyone close enough to hear. She should not have cared. Robert Langley owed her nothing. A few repaired harnesses and cups of coffee did not mean anything. Still, her fingers became very careful around the handle of her cup. Virginia took one step closer. "Our families have always gotten along." Robert looked at her. "They have, and I think our fathers hoped that might become something permanent." The fiddle music continued across the barn. Robert glanced briefly toward Martha, then back to Virginia. "My cattle have never chosen my wife for me." Peter looked down so quickly his chin nearly hit his chest. Martha's breath caught. Virginia did not move. For 1 second, the pleasant expression slipped. Then it returned. Naturally. Her hand tightened around the stem of the small cider glass she carried. Not enough to break it. Enough that her knuckles whitened. "I suppose a man ought to know his own mind." "He ought." Virginia nodded. "Enjoy your evening." She walked away. Martha stared into her coffee. Robert sat again. Nobody spoke. Finally, Peter reached for the cornbread. "Anybody want this?" 3 men answered at once. Conversation resumed. But Martha could no longer pretend she had imagined the tension. Robert had not promised her anything. He had not even said Virginia's implication was wrong because of Martha. Yet something had changed. She felt it in the way Virginia had looked at her and in the way Robert now kept his eyes on his plate. Later the tables were pushed farther toward the walls. The fiddle picked up. Couples moved onto the open floor. Martha stayed seated. Robert did too. "You don't dance?" she asked. "Not well. I find that difficult to believe." "Why?" "You're good with horses. Horses don't care where my feet are." She smiled. Robert looked toward the dancers. "What about you, no?" "Can't?" "Don't." He seemed to understand the difference. The barn grew warmer as the evening went on. Martha finally slipped the shawl from her shoulders and folded it over the back of her chair. Near 9, Susan came by and said she intended to leave before the road froze hard. "I'll walk back with you," Martha said. Susan glanced toward Robert. "No need to rush." "Susan, I'm going." She left before Martha could argue. Martha stayed another 20 minutes. Then she remembered the shawl had been moved earlier when the tables were rearranged. I need to find something. Robert started to stand. It's only my shawl. He stopped. Martha crossed toward the side of the barn. The temporary cloakroom had been set up beyond a partition near the rear doors, where coats, wraps, and hats were hung from pegs hammered into old stallboards. Her shawl wasn't there. She stepped through the side door toward the narrow passage behind the barn, thinking perhaps Susan had moved it. The night air struck cold against her bare arms. Lantern light reached only a few yards beyond the doorway. Martha? She turned. No one. Only the sound of fiddle music through the wall. Then footsteps. Soft. Close. Coming around the far end of the barn. Martha waited. Who's there? The footsteps stopped. A second later, something moved in the darkness near the cloakroom entrance. Martha took one step toward it, then another. She could smell leather, lamp oil, and something sharper. Something she knew from George Parker's shelves. Harness stain. Her eyes dropped toward the blue skirt. A dark splash glistened across the wool. For one stunned second, Martha could not understand what she was seeing. Then she heard someone behind the partition laugh. It wasn't loud. That made it worse. A quick little sound, covered almost immediately by fiddle music and boots moving across the barn floor. Martha looked down. The dark stain had struck the lower back of the dress first, then run in crooked streams across the blue wool. Harness stain. Thick, oily, almost black beneath the lantern light. Her hand moved toward it before she stopped herself. Touching it would only spread it. Then she saw the cut. It began near her left hip and ran downward through the outer panel of the skirt. Not enough to expose her underclothes, but enough that the fabric hung open several inches where someone had drawn a blade through it. Martha's breath shortened. She turned the skirt with both hands. The cut crossed the hem, crossed the repair, crossed the old stitches her mother had made. For a moment, she heard nothing. Not the fiddle, not the talking, not the horses shifting outside. Only her mother's voice from years before, telling her to keep the thread loose enough that the wool could moite beneath it. Martha pressed the torn cloth together. Someone came through the rear doorway. A young woman Martha barely knew stopped, saw the dress, then covered her mouth. Oh. That one word carried into the cloakroom. Another woman appeared. Then a man. Then two more. People always seemed to gather quickly around another person's humiliation. What happened? Look at the back. Good Lord. Martha reached for her shawl. It wasn't on the peg. Someone must have moved it. She looked around more urgently. A woman near the doorway whispered something to her companion. The companion laughed. Martha found her shawl on a bench beneath several men's coats and snatched it up, but the narrow strip of dark wool could not cover the whole stained skirt. Well, someone said from behind her, at least now nobody has to pretend it was pretty. A few people laughed. Martha stopped. She knew that voice. Not well enough to place a name on it. Well enough to know it belonged to someone who had smiled at her earlier that evening. Heat climbed from Martha's chest into her face. She turned. Nobody met her eyes. That was almost impressive. A dozen people had been bold enough to look when she walked into the barn. Now suddenly, everyone seemed fascinated by walls, pegs, hats, and floorboards. Martha pulled the shawl around herself. She could leave through the back. The boarding house was less than half a mile away. She could make it there before most of the supper ended. She could take off the dress. Fold it. No. Not fold it. The cut would never lie flat again. The stain might never come out. Her fingers tightened around the wool. Susan had told her not to think good things belonged more naturally to somebody else. Martha had tried. For one evening she had tried, and Dry Creek had answered. She took one step toward the rear door, then another. "Martha?" George Parker stood beyond the partition. His face changed when he saw her. "What happened?" "I don't know." He looked at the stain, then the cut. "Who did that?" Martha shook her head. George turned toward the growing crowd. "Who was back here?" Nobody answered. A few people drifted away. George's jaw tightened. "Martha, wait here." No, she wanted air. She wanted darkness. She wanted a room with a door she could close. "Martha, I'm going home." She moved toward the rear exit. Then the fiddle stopped. Not gradually. A note cut off halfway through. The sudden quiet rolled through the barn. Martha froze. George looked past her. So did everyone else. Robert Langley stood at the end of the partition. He had been halfway across the barn when the music stopped. Martha could tell from the way his coat still hung open and the fact that one glove remained tucked into his belt. His gaze found her first, then moved downward. Blue wool, black stain, torn hem. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Robert was not a dramatic man. His eyes simply went still. He walked toward her. People moved without being asked. At 6'7", Robert had always seemed large. Now he seemed to take up every inch of the narrow passage. He stopped in front of Martha. For once, she could not hold his eyes. She looked down instead. "I was leaving." Robert didn't answer. He removed his black coat. Martha looked up. "Robert, you don't have to." He placed it around her shoulders. The coat was far too large. Heavy wool dropped nearly to her knees, swallowing the worst of the stain and torn fabric. It still carried the cold evening air from when he had stepped outside earlier, and faintly, underneath, the smell of leather and pine smoke. Martha caught the lapels together. Robert turned. The entire rear half of the barn had gone silent. "Who did it?" His voice was quiet. Nobody answered. Robert looked from face to face. There was no shouting, no threat. That was not necessary. Somebody did. A man near the doorway shifted his weight. One of the women stared at the floor. Virginia Hale stood several yards away near a support post, one hand wrapped around her cider glass. Her face was unreadable. Louise Carter stood beside her, pale gloves folded neatly at her waist. Martha noticed them only because everyone else had become a blur. Robert waited. Still, nobody spoke. Reverend Joseph Warren approached slowly from the main room. Robert did not look at him. Someone damaged her dress. "I can see that." Then someone saw something. The Reverend glanced around. "Perhaps this isn't the place." "This is exactly the place." Martha touched Robert's sleeve. His attention shifted to her immediately. That small change hurt almost more than the laughter had. "Don't," she said. His jaw worked once. Martha kept her voice low. "Please." Robert looked at her for a long moment. Then he faced the room again. "I asked a simple question." No answer. The silence itself became an answer of another kind. Whoever had done it was not alone in what they thought. Maybe only one hand had held the stain. Maybe only one blade had cut the cloth. But plenty of people had found it funny. Robert seemed to understand that too. He turned back to Martha. "Do you want to leave?" The question surprised her. She had expected him to tell her they were leaving, or to escort her out, or to decide what was best because he was angry and she was embarrassed. Instead, he waited. "Do you want to leave?" Martha looked toward the rear door. The dark road beyond it seemed inviting. Susan's boarding house, her little room, the trunk, a basin of cold water. Safety. She could be out of the barn in 30 seconds. Then someone snickered. Just once, from somewhere near the partition. Martha closed her eyes. There it was again. That expectation, that if they made her uncomfortable enough, she would remove herself for them. She opened her eyes. Robert was still waiting. Not rescuing. Waiting. Martha lifted one hand and wiped at the corner of her eye before anything could fall. Then she looked down at the damaged skirt beneath Robert's coat. Her mother's stitches were cut, but not gone. The thread was still there. So was she. No. Robert's brow moved slightly. Martha took a breath. "I don't want to leave." Another pause. Then Robert nodded. "All right." Martha looked toward the table where they had been sitting. Her chair remained there, empty. Robert walked back with her. The crowd parted. No one said anything. Martha could hear every step she took, the faint scrape of her boot, the rustle of Robert's coat around her. Someone setting down a cup too carefully. When they reached the Stone Ridge table, Peter Wallace rose so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. He looked at the stained wool visible beneath Robert's coat, then at Martha. "Ma'am." He pulled her chair out. Martha sat. Robert took his place beside her. Peter slowly sat too. The other ranch hands followed. Nobody knew what to say. Finally, Robert reached for the coffee pot. Martha watched his large hand close around the handle. He poured her cup, then his own. "Still taking cream?" The question was so ordinary that Martha nearly laughed. Her throat tightened instead. "Yes." Robert slid the cream pitcher toward her. The fiddle player remained silent across the barn, bow hanging awkwardly at his side. Reverend Warren walked over to him. A few words passed between them. The fiddle began again, slowly, uneasily. Conversation followed in pieces. Not normal, but trying. Martha lifted the cup. Her hand shook once against the saucer. Robert noticed. He said nothing. He simply moved his forearm onto the edge of the table, creating a dark wall of wool between Martha and the aisle where most people would have to pass. Peter began talking about a broken gate at Stone Ridge. Another ranch hand answered. The conversation was clumsy at first, then steadier. Martha contributed almost nothing. She didn't need to. She was still there. That was enough. Across the room, Virginia Hale watched from beside her father's table. Her face had lost its earlier composure. Louise leaned close and murmured something. Virginia did not answer. Martha saw none of it. She kept both hands around her coffee mug and stared at the steam. After several minutes, Robert spoke without turning his head. "I'm sorry." Martha looked at him. "For what?" "For this town." A tired smile touched her mouth. "You don't own the town." "No." "Then stop apologizing for it." Robert looked at her. The faintest shift passed through his expression. Respect. Something warmer beneath it. All right. They stayed until Reverend Warren announced the final dance. Martha did not dance. Neither did Robert. When she finally stood to leave, most of the crowd had already gone. Robert walked her and Susan back to the boarding house beneath a moon sharp enough to silver the wagon ruts. He kept several feet between himself and Martha. Close enough that she knew he was there, far enough that nobody could mistake protection for possession. At Susan's porch, Martha removed his coat. Robert shook his head. "Keep it until tomorrow. I'll get stain on it. It's a coat." She stared at him. He seemed to realize the words had come out wrong. "I mean, it can be cleaned." Martha looked down at the blue fabric visible beneath the black wool. "Some things can't." Robert had no answer for that. He nodded once. "Good night, Martha." "Good night." Susan unlocked the door. Before Martha went inside, Robert spoke again. "They wanted you to leave." She turned. He stood at the bottom of the steps, hat in one hand. "Whoever did it." Martha waited. Robert looked back toward the dark barn at the end of town. They weren't just trying to ruin a dress. His eyes returned to hers. "They expected you to disappear." Martha pulled his coat closer against the cold. "They'll be disappointed." Robert's mouth moved faintly. "Good." He walked away. Upstairs, Martha placed the lamp beside her bed and finally removed the dress. Under stronger light, the damage looked worse. The stain had soaked through the wool. The cut ran cleanly through the skirt and into the hem. Martha sat on the edge of the bed with the blue fabric across her knees. For a long time she did nothing. Then her fingers found the cut. She traced it carefully, stopped, went back. The edge was strange, too clean in places, slightly curved in others. Martha leaned closer to the lamp. She had seen a cut like that before. Many times. Not from ordinary sewing scissors, from heavy leather shears, the kind kept in a harness shop. Martha slowly lifted her eyes toward the dark window. The dress had not been damaged by accident. Someone had come prepared. Martha sat very still on the edge of the bed. The boarding house had gone quiet around her. Pipes clicked somewhere behind the wall. A wagon passed in the alley, wheels grinding over frozen ruts before fading into the night. She lifted the skirt closer to the lamp. The cut was narrow at the top, wider near the hem, and curved slightly inward where the blades had closed. Martha knew that bite. She had seen it hundreds of times in heavy leather. Not sewing scissors. Leather shears. The sort with thick handles and short, powerful blades. Her first thought was George's shop. Her second was that she did not want it to be George's shop. Martha laid the dress carefully across the chair and did not sleep much. At 7 the next morning, she was standing outside Dry Creek Harness and Freight Supply before George had finished unlocking the front door. He glanced at her face, then at the bundle beneath her arm. "What happened?" "You know what happened. I mean, why are you here this early?" Martha stepped inside. "Close the door." George did. She carried the dress into the back room and spread the damaged skirt across her workbench. Daylight made the black stain look even uglier. George's mouth tightened. "Lord." Martha pointed at the cut. "Look at the edge." George bent closer. "What about it?" "Don't look at the cloth. Look at the shape." She brought one of the ordinary sewing scissors from the drawer and cut a small piece of scrap wool. Straight. Clean. Then she crossed to the tool rack. One hook was empty. Martha stopped. George followed her eyes. "What?" She pointed. "Where are the large shears?" George frowned. "The leather pair?" "Yes." He looked beneath the bench, then inside the lower cabinet. "Thought you had them. I haven't used them since Thursday." George began searching in earnest. The shears were not in the front shop. not beneath the cutting table, not behind the oil tins, not in the canvas cabinet. George returned to the back room with his face darker than before. Missing. Martha said nothing. George looked at the dress again. You think somebody used my shears? I think somebody used shears exactly like yours. He leaned over the fabric. Martha traced the curve with one fingertip. See this? The blades pull slightly when they close. Yours do the same thing because the lower edge is worn. George swore under his breath. Then his eyes moved toward the shelf above Martha's bench. A line of brown bottles stood there. Harness oil, neat's foot oil, black stain, leather dressing. George reached up. He counted, then counted again. One's gone. Martha looked at him. The imported stain? George nodded slowly. Came in from Helena 2 weeks ago. 3 bottles. I sold one. One's here. He touched the empty place between them. And the third? Should be right there. They stood without speaking. The back room suddenly felt smaller. George rubbed both hands over his face. Who has access? You. You. Anyone who comes through the shop while one of us is in front. George looked toward the curtain. Customers crossed that room every day. Freight hands, ranchers, women buying straps, children sent for buckles, people waiting while George checked invoices. Martha thought of the harvest supper, someone behind the partition, the smell of harness stain, the laugh. George spoke first. We tell Dalton. Martha shook her head. No. No. The sheriff will hear that a dress was ruined. A dress was ruined. He'll hear women arguing at a supper. Jealousy. Foolishness. He'll tell me to stay away from whoever I offended. George stared at her. You think this isn't serious? I think I know how serious it is. Then why? The front door opened. Heavy boots crossed the floor. George and Martha both stopped. Robert appeared beneath the curtain. He carried his black coat over one arm. Martha had cleaned the small smear along the bottom before returning it to him, though the wool still smelled faintly of soap. Robert's eyes moved from her to George, then to the blue dress spread across the bench. What happened? Martha almost laughed. You were there. I mean now. George answered. She found something. Robert stepped closer. Martha showed him the cut, then the empty hook, then the missing bottle. He listened without interruption. When she finished, Robert looked toward George. Who knew the shears were here? Anybody who's been in the shop. Who knew about the stain? George shrugged. It's sold openly. Robert picked up the dress only after glancing at Martha for permission. She nodded. His large fingers held the damaged hem with surprising care. The same stain? Almost certainly. He gave the cloth back. We tell Dalton. Martha sighed. George already said that. And I said no. Robert watched her. Martha began folding the dress. I don't want the whole town discussing it again. They already are. I know. So what's the difference? The difference is whether I hand them another reason. Robert leaned one hand on the bench. They stole tools. Probably. They damaged your property. Yes. Deliberately. Robert, why are you protecting whoever did it? Martha's head came up. I'm not. Then what are you doing? She stared at him. George quietly found a reason to inspect something in the front room. Martha lowered her voice. I am trying not to spend another week being watched every time I cross the street. Robert did not answer immediately. she continued. You don't know what that is like. His expression changed slightly. No. Martha looked down at the dress. I walked into that barn wearing something my mother helped make. By the time I walked out, half the town knew exactly how much they could hurt me with it. Her fingers rested on the damaged hem. I don't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me drag it into the sheriff's office. Robert's gaze stayed on her hand. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. Whoever did this counted on that. Martha looked up. He nodded toward the dress. Counted on shame keeping you quiet. The room remained still. A horse snorted outside. Someone hammered a nail farther down the street. Martha folded one side of the skirt over the other, then stopped. Robert did not push. That mattered. He simply stood there, hat in one hand, waiting for her to decide. Martha let out a slow breath. All right. George's head appeared around the curtain. All right, what? We go to Dalton. George grabbed his coat. Sheriff Frank Dalton's office occupied 2 rooms beside the livery. The front held a desk, a gun rack, 2 chairs, a stove, and a wall calendar turned to September 1886. The back room held one narrow cell and a cot that looked less comfortable than Susan Bell's kitchen floor. Dalton was 53, thick through the shoulders, with a sandy mustache gone gray at the ends. He listened while Martha spoke. His expression stayed polite, then tired. A dress. George shifted beside her. Not just the dress. The tools were stolen, Martha said. And the stain. Dalton rubbed his jaw. You saw who did it? No. Anyone threaten you? No. Anyone admit it? No. He leaned back. Miss Bennett, I don't doubt somebody behaved badly, but unless we have a witness, Robert spoke from behind her. Then find one. Dalton looked up. Langley, you have a barn full of people. A barn full of people who apparently didn't see anything. Start asking. Dalton's jaw tightened. Martha glanced toward Robert. His face remained calm. Dalton pulled a sheet of paper from a drawer. All right. He dipped his pen. Date of incident? Saturday night. Approximate time? A little after 9. He wrote. Property damaged. 1 women's wool dress. Martha winced at how small it sounded on paper. Dalton looked at her. Value? Martha thought of her mother. There was no useful answer to that. $8 in cloth and buttons. The sheriff wrote $8. George spoke. 1 pair heavy leather shears, $1.75. 1 bottle black harness stain, Martha added, 70 cents. Dalton wrote those down too. Facts changed the room. A ruined dress sounded like gossip. Stolen tools, missing merchandise, and a written complaint sounded different. When Dalton finished, he sanded the page and shook it clean. Who do you suspect? Martha hesitated. Robert did not answer for her. George did not either. That mattered too. Virginia Hale was unhappy that Robert and I were sitting together. Dalton's eyebrows rose. That all? That's all I know. Shh. She threaten you? No. Argue with you? No. Then that's thin, I know. Dalton tapped his pen against the desk. But half the town saw her watching you. Martha's stomach tightened. I didn't say she did it. No. I'm saying people will. Robert's expression hardened. Then question her before they decide the answer for you. Dalton looked at him for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. I'll speak with her. Outside, the morning had warmed enough to soften the frost into mud. George went back toward the shop. Robert walked beside Martha. Neither spoke for most of the block. At the boarding house corner, Martha stopped. "Thank you." Robert looked at her. For what? For not answering for me in there. His brow tightened as if the idea had not occurred to him. "It was your complaint." "Some men forget that." "I won't." Martha looked toward the street. A pair of women stood outside the mercantile talking. One glanced toward them. Martha almost turned away. Instead, she held her ground. Robert noticed. "Are you going back to work?" "Yes." "Good. You sound relieved." "I've got 3 harness sets waiting." Martha looked at him. A faint trace of humor sat behind his eyes. "Then I suppose I should hurry." She walked back toward Parker's shop. Robert watched her go. By noon, Sheriff Dalton had crossed the street toward Hale Mercantile. Virginia was inside. So was Louise Carter. And before Dalton reached the door, a Stone Ridge ranch hand came riding hard into town, dust flying from his horse's legs. He dismounted in front of Parker's shop and pushed through the door without knocking. "Mr. Langley here?" George looked up. "No." The young man was breathing hard. Might want to find him. Martha stepped through the curtain. "What happened?" The ranch hand looked at her. 2 harness sets failed this morning." Martha's eyes went to the empty hook where George's shears had hung. "Failed how?" The young man swallowed. "Same place." And for the first time, the damaged blue dress no longer looked like the worst thing somebody had planned. George came around the counter. "Where are the harnesses?" "At Stone Ridge." The ranch hand pulled off his hat. He was young, lean, with dust darkening the shoulders of his coat. "Mr. Langley's checking them now. He told me to come for Parker." George glanced toward Martha, then toward the half-finished work covering his front bench. "I can't leave." The ranch hand looked frustrated. "We've got a shipment moving in less than 2 weeks." "I know what you've got." George rubbed a hand over his mouth. Martha spoke before she had time to reconsider. "I can go." Both men turned. George frowned. "No." "Why?" "Because this isn't town work. Harness is harness. Stone Ridge is 10 miles out." "I know where it is." The ranch hand looked at Martha as if trying to decide whether she was serious. George lowered his voice. "Martha." She understood what he meant. Not the road, not the work, the talk. A woman spending entire days at Robert Langley's ranch would give Dry Creek something new to chew on before supper. Martha looked toward the folded blue dress on the shelf behind her. They already talk. George had no answer to that. The ranch hand shifted his hat between his hands. "Mr. Langley said, if Parker couldn't come, bring whoever did the last repairs." George looked at him sharply. "He said that?" "Yes, sir." Martha reached for her coat. Stone Ridge Ranch sat beyond a long stretch of rolling grass west of Dry Creek, where the land began rising toward the crazy mountains. The road was better than Martha expected. 2 wagon tracks crossed open pasture, passed through a shallow creek lined with cottonwoods, then climbed gradually toward darker pine country. The ranch hand introduced himself as Peter Wallace halfway there. He was 25 and talked more once he realized Martha could ride without complaint. "Boss doesn't like wasted equipment. Most ranchers don't. He likes it less." Martha adjusted her gloves. "That why you rode into town as if someone was chasing you?" Peter gave her a sideways glance. 2 traces failed in the same morning. One on the feed wagon, one on a braking rig. "Anyone hurt?" "No." "Then you were lucky." Boss said the same thing. Martha looked ahead. Stone Ridge appeared slowly. First fences, then cattle scattered across yellowing grass. A long barn stood near the base of a low ridge, with corrals stretching behind it. The main house sat farther uphill, built of squared timber with a wide porch facing east. Nothing about the place was grand. Everything looked used, maintained, necessary. Robert was waiting near the tack building when they rode in. His sleeves were rolled above his forearms. One damaged harness lay across a rail in front of him. He looked at Peter. "Where's George?" "Couldn't leave the shop." Robert's gaze moved to Martha. Peter continued. "She volunteered." Martha dismounted. "If you'd rather wait for George—" "No." Robert took her horse's reins. "You're here." He tied the horse to the rail and stepped aside. No surprise. No concern about what anyone might think. Just work. That helped. Martha removed her gloves. "Show me." The first trace looked worn at a glance. She bent it beneath the light. The leather had separated near an old stitch line. Not cut. Not obviously. She ran her thumb across the break. "How old?" 3 years, Robert said. "Used hard?" "Yes." "Could be ordinary wear?" Peter exhaled. Martha turned to the second harness. That one bothered her more. The leather was newer, the stitching sound. Yet the same section had weakened. Martha opened the fold. A shallow mark ran beneath it. Too narrow to call a cut. Too straight to ignore. Robert crouched beside her. "You see something?" "Maybe." "That's not an answer." "It is until I'm certain." Peter tried to hide a grin. Robert looked at him. Peter became interested in a nearby fence post. Martha examined the rest of the harness. Then another. By noon, 3 more questionable pieces were spread across the tack room table. Robert stood with both hands braced on the wood. "You think they're failing too fast?" "I know they are." "Why?" "Don't know yet." Martha picked up a breast strap. "Some of this leather is older than it should be. Some is wearing unevenly. And whoever keeps your repair records isn't writing down enough detail." Robert looked toward Peter. Peter lifted both hands. "I don't keep the books." "Who does?" Martha asked. Robert rubbed his jaw. "Mostly me." She looked at him. He looked back. "That explains it." Peter laughed before he could stop himself. Robert turned slowly. "Something funny?" "No, boss." Martha tried not to smile. Robert saw that too. "Ledger's in the house." He turned toward the door. "Come on." The Stone Ridge kitchen was larger than Martha expected, and considerably less orderly. A black stove sat against one wall. Tin cups hung from hooks. Bills, cattle receipts, supply lists, and folded correspondence occupied one end of the table beside a cold coffee pot. Robert gathered the papers into a pile. Martha watched. "You keep ranch accounts like that? They're all there." "That wasn't my question." Robert set the ledger in front of her. "Do your worst." Martha opened it. His handwriting was large and square. Dates, purchases, cattle counts, freight charges, harness replacements. Most entries were correct. Some were maddeningly vague. "Leather," she read aloud. Robert poured coffee. "Bought leather, how much?" "Enough, for what?" "Repairs." "Which repairs?" He set a tin mug beside her. "Don't remember." Martha looked up at him. "Then this entry is useless." Robert leaned against the table. You've been here 10 minutes, and you've insulted my bookkeeping twice. I criticized it. Difference? An insult would involve your character. Peter, standing in the doorway, covered his mouth. Robert pointed toward the barn. Go find something useful to do. Peter disappeared. Martha took a sip of coffee. It was strong enough to remove paint. She said nothing. Robert noticed. Bad? I've had worse. Where? I don't remember. For the first time, Robert laughed. Not much. One short sound. It changed his whole face. Then it was gone. They spent the afternoon in the tack room. Martha began marking each damaged piece with chalk and listing it by date, location, and type of wear. Robert fetched everything she asked for. Awls, oil, thread, replacement leather. He never hovered. When she needed him, he appeared. When she didn't, he worked nearby. By 4 o'clock, Peter returned carrying a wagon trace. Found another. Martha checked it. The leather was stretched nearly white near the buckle. She turned it over. A weak line ran beneath the fold. Don't use this. Peter frowned. I checked that yesterday. You checked the outside. Martha showed him the underside. If this tears under load, you'll lose control of whatever's behind it. Peter's face changed. I missed that, yes. He seemed to expect mockery. Martha handed the trace back. Now you won't next time. Peter looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. Something shifted after that. Small, but real. The ranch hands stopped watching Martha as though she were a curiosity Robert had brought home from town. One asked whether she could look at a saddle rig. Another brought a split rein. By sunset, Martha had more work than she could finish in 2 days. Robert stood in the tack room doorway. George won't be able to spare you this long. No. I could hire you here temporarily. Martha stopped stitching. For how long? Until the shipment goes out. 2 weeks? Maybe 3. She looked toward the open door. Across the yard, Peter and another hand were carrying feed sacks into the barn. Martha could already imagine what Dry Creek would say. Robert seemed to read it. You don't have to, I know. I'd pay $1.25 a day, meals included. That was better than George paid. Much better. Martha looked at him. Why? Robert's brow furrowed. Because I need the work done. That's all. He held her gaze. Should there be something else? Martha felt foolish immediately. No. Robert waited. She returned to the harness. I'll do it. Good. But I keep my room at Susan's. Didn't ask you to move. I know. And if anyone in town decides that means something, they already have. Martha looked at him. The same sentence she had given George. Robert's mouth shifted slightly. Fair enough. The days that followed found a rhythm. Martha rode out from Dry Creek shortly after sunrise and returned before dark. At Stone Ridge, she worked from a bench near the tack room window. Robert passed through often, sometimes with equipment, sometimes with receipts, sometimes apparently for no reason Martha could identify. The ledger improved under protest. She created separate pages for repairs, freight, and purchases. Robert watched her rule lines with a straight edge. Seems excessive. It's organized. Same thing. No. He brought coffee anyway. One evening, clouds gathered low over the mountains and the light faded early. Martha was repairing the cuff of Robert's winter coat near the kitchen stove while he sorted cattle receipts. He glanced up. What's wrong with it? Your sleeve seam was separating. I hadn't noticed. I did. You fixing clothing now too? It's the same principle. Robert watched her needle pass through the heavy cloth. You don't have to, I know. Neither said anything after that. The stove clicked softly. Wind moved against the window glass. Robert pushed the lamp closer to her side of the table. A small gesture. Nothing more. Martha bent over the coat. Something about the silence no longer felt empty. 3 days later, she was checking a newly cleaned harness when her thumb caught on something beneath the inner strap. She stopped, pulled the leather back. There, a narrow slice. Hidden from sight. Shallow enough that the harness would pass inspection. Deep enough that strain would slowly open it. Martha's breathing changed. Robert noticed from across the room, "What?" She did not answer. She placed the strap beside the damaged blue dress in her mind. Same shape, same curve, same deliberate patience. Robert came closer. Martha turned the harness toward him. This wasn't wear. His face went still. You're sure? Martha traced the hidden cut with one fingernail. Yes. Outside, one of the ranch hands called to another across the yard. A horse kicked against a stall board. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary afternoon. Martha looked at Robert. Someone cut this. And suddenly, Stone Ridge no longer felt safely removed from whatever had begun in Dry Creek. Robert took the harness from Martha and carried it to the tack room window. The afternoon light was fading, but there was enough left to show the damage clearly once he bent the leather back. The slice sat underneath the strap where no one would see it during an ordinary inspection. Robert ran his thumb along it. Could it have happened against a buckle? No. Fence wire? No. Knife? Martha shook her head. Too clean. Too shallow. Whoever did it wanted the leather weakened, not severed. Robert looked toward the racks lining the wall. How many more? I don't know. That answer changed the room. Robert stepped into the yard and called Peter Wallace. Within 15 minutes, every working harness from the main barn had been brought into the tack room. Martha stood at the long table beneath 2 lanterns, while Peter stacked leather around her. Driving harness, saddle rigging, traces, breast collars. Robert said nothing unnecessary. He only brought what she asked for. Martha checked each piece slowly. She flexed the leather, opened folds, ran her fingers beneath stitching, held suspicious areas beneath the lantern. The first 6 were clean. So were the next 4. Then she found another. A supply wagon trace. The cut ran almost exactly where the leather would pull hardest during a downhill descent. Martha stopped breathing for a moment. Robert. He was beside her immediately. She showed him. His eyes hardened. What wagon? Peter answered. Gray supply wagon. Robert looked at him. When was it due out? Tuesday morning. Loaded? Flour, salt, lamp oil, fencing staples. About 1,200 pounds, maybe more. Who drives? Peter hesitated. You. Robert's face didn't move. And? Me and Samuel usually ride with you. Martha looked down at the cut again. A wagon carrying that weight down Stone Ridge's eastern grade would pull hard against the team. If one trace failed, the load could swing. If the second followed... She stopped herself. No reason to imagine the rest. Peter understood anyway. His face had gone pale beneath the dust. That would have held long enough to get us moving. Martha nodded. Probably. And then? She looked at him. Probably not. The tack room went silent. Outside, a cow bawled from the lower pasture. A hammer struck twice near the corral. Ordinary ranch sounds. They felt strange now. Robert laid the damaged trace flat on the table. Nobody uses anything until she clears it. Peter nodded. Yes, sir. Every saddle, every harness, every wagon rig. All of it? All of it. Peter looked toward Martha. She was already reaching for the next strap. Start bringing it. By dark, Martha's hands hurt from bending leather. She had marked 3 pieces with white chalk and set them apart. Only 2 showed clear, deliberate cuts. That was enough. Robert stood over the table, looking at the damaged equipment. Martha washed her hands in a basin near the stove. Black water ran from her fingers. It matches the dress, she said. Robert looked at her. The cut? The shape? The pressure mark? The slight pull at the end? You can tell that? I've spent years looking at what blades do to leather. She dried her hands. And cloth. Robert's jaw tightened. So whoever ruined your dress came here. Or someone here used the same shears. Peter, standing near the door, looked uncomfortable. I don't like the sound of that. Neither do I, Robert said. Martha glanced around the room. Who has access to this building? Every Stone Ridge hand. Anyone from town? Freight crews? Buyers? Suppliers? Robert paused. Albert Hale's men were here last week. Martha looked up. When? Thursday. The day before the harvest supper. Peter frowned. They were checking the October cattle count. Martha exchanged a look with Robert. Neither said Virginia's name. Neither needed to. At sunrise the next morning, Robert rode to Dry Creek. Martha went with him. The road had hardened after the previous week's rain. Wagon wheels rattled over the dry ruts, and frost lay white beneath the cottonwoods along the creek. Sheriff Frank Dalton was eating breakfast from a tin plate when they entered his office. He looked at Robert, then at Martha, then at the wrapped harness Robert placed on his desk. What now? Martha unwrapped the leather. Dalton put down his fork. Robert said, Someone tried to make a wagon fail. Dalton's expression changed. Martha showed him the hidden cut, then the second. She explained where they had been found and which wagon the trace belonged to. Dalton leaned closer. You're certain this wasn't where? Yes. How certain? Martha pointed toward the edge. See the fibers here? They were parted from the inside. Where frays outward, this was cut and then folded back into place. Dalton rubbed one finger along the damage. Robert stood with both hands resting on the back of the chair in front of him. The wagon would have carried 3 men Tuesday. Dalton looked at him. You? Yes. That took the last of the reluctance from the sheriff's face. He pushed his breakfast aside. All right. Martha noticed the difference. A ruined dress had earned a polite complaint. A sabotaged wagon earned an investigation. She could have been angry about that. Instead, she was tired. Dalton pulled his notebook from a drawer. Start at the beginning. We already did, Martha said. Start again. So they did. The stolen shears, the missing stain, the ruined blue dress, the ranch harnesses, the Hale visit, the dates. Dalton wrote everything down. When he finished, he tapped the pencil against the page. Virginia Hale? Martha folded her hands in her lap. She had reason to dislike me. That's not proof, I know. Did she know where Parker kept the shears? Anyone could have seen them. Did she have access to Stone Ridge? Her father's business did, Robert answered. Dalton looked at him. You're thinking she's behind both. Robert's expression stayed flat. I'm thinking somebody is. Dalton closed the notebook. I'll speak to the Hales, Martha said, carefully. The sheriff looked at her. If Virginia didn't do this, accusing her publicly will only make things worse. Dalton gave a short nod. That's the first sensible thing anybody's said about this mess. Robert looked at him. Dalton corrected himself. Besides you two. Outside the office, Martha pulled her gloves on against the cold. Robert stood beside the hitch rail. You all right? Yes. You don't sound it. Martha looked across the street. Virginia Hale was stepping out of the Mercantile with Louise Carter beside her. Virginia wore a gray traveling coat. Louise carried a package tied in brown paper. Neither woman saw them at first. Then Virginia did. She stopped. Her face changed slightly when she noticed Robert beside Martha. Louise followed her gaze. For one moment, all four of them stood separated by the width of Dry Creek's main street. Then Virginia turned and walked away. Louise went with her. Martha watched them until they disappeared behind a wagon. Do you think she did it? Robert asked. Martha took her time answering. I think she wanted me embarrassed. That's not what I asked. No. She looked at him. I don't know if she wanted you dead. Robert's eyes shifted toward the sheriff's office. Neither do I. They returned to Stone Ridge before noon. Martha spent the rest of the day clearing equipment. By supper, every harness safe enough to use bore a small white chalk mark near the buckle. Peter began calling them Martha Marks. She pretended not to hear. After dark, Robert found her alone in the tack room. A lamp burned beside the damaged supply wagon trace. Martha was staring at it. You missed supper. I wasn't hungry. That's what Susan says you say when you're worried. Martha looked up. You've been talking to Susan? She talks to everybody. True. Robert set a plate beside her. Cold beef, bread, an apple. Martha looked at it. You brought this all the way from the house? 40 yards. Heroic. Nearly killed me. She smiled despite herself. Robert pulled a stool over but did not sit too close. For several minutes, Martha ate while he examined a strip of replacement leather. Then he said, You saved us. Martha stopped. We don't know that. I do. You hadn't left yet. Tuesday we would have. She looked down at the bread in her hands. Robert continued. Peter wouldn't have found that cut. He will next time. I wouldn't have either. Martha glanced at him. He wasn't flattering her. That was the trouble. He meant it. You found it because you notice things the rest of us don't. Martha looked toward the harness racks. For most of my life, people noticed me before they noticed anything I could do. Robert's eyes stayed on her. She gave a quiet laugh. Funny thing is, it made me very good at noticing things back. Robert set the leather down. I noticed what you could do. Martha's fingers went still around the apple. He seemed to hear his own words only after they were spoken. The silence between them changed. Robert looked toward the lamp. Martha looked down. Neither rescued the other from it. At last, Robert stood. Finish eating. Yes, sir. He gave her a look. Martha bit into the apple. He walked to the door. Before stepping outside, he stopped. Martha. She looked up. Finding you at Stone Ridge may have saved 3 lives. He did not wait for an answer. He went into the dark yard. Martha sat alone beneath the lamp for a long time after that. The next morning, Sheriff Dalton rode into Stone Ridge shortly after 9, but he wasn't alone. Virginia Hale rode beside him. She dismounted before anyone could offer a hand. Her face was pale. Her gloves were clenched around the reins. Robert came from the barn. Martha stepped out of the tack room. Virginia looked at Robert only once. Then she looked directly at Martha. "I need to speak with you." Dalton started to follow. Virginia shook her head. "Not with you." Robert's expression tightened. Virginia looked at Martha again. "Privately." Martha wiped her hands on her apron. "About what?" Virginia swallowed, then said the one thing Martha had not expected. "About who ruined your dress." Robert's eyes moved from Virginia to Martha. Martha could see the question there. She gave the smallest nod. "Inside," she said. They used the Stone Ridge kitchen because it was warmer than the tack room, and because Sheriff Dalton could wait outside without hearing every word through thin boards. Robert poured coffee into 3 tin cups, then stopped. Virginia looked at him. "I didn't ask you to stay." Robert set the pot down. "This is my house." Martha almost smiled. Virginia did not. For a moment the two of them simply looked at each other. Then Martha pulled out a chair. "Sit." Virginia obeyed. That alone told Martha something was wrong. The Virginia Hale she had seen at the harvest supper would never have sat because Martha Bennett told her to. Now she sat with both hands folded over her gloves. Robert remained near the stove, not crowding, not leaving. Virginia stared at the grain of the table. "I did say things about you." Martha waited. "I laughed." "I know. I wanted people to laugh." Martha's jaw tightened. Virginia swallowed. "I thought if people made it unpleasant enough, you'd stop attending things. Stop giving them something to talk about." "You mean stop sitting beside Robert?" Virginia's face colored. "Yes." Robert's expression did not change. Martha leaned back. "So you wanted me humiliated?" Virginia looked up. "Yes." The honesty was ugly. Martha preferred it to excuses. "But I did not ruin the dress." "Why should I believe you?" "Because if I'd done it, I wouldn't have come here. That proves nothing." Virginia nodded once. "No, it doesn't." Rain clouds were gathering over the western ridge, turning the kitchen window gray. Virginia looked toward Robert. "My cousin Louise was with me that night." "Louise Carter," Martha said. "Yes." Virginia removed one glove finger by finger. She knew I was angry. Everyone knew. Not like she did. Virginia looked at her hands. "I told her you worked in Parker's back room. I told her Robert kept going there. I told her I was tired of hearing your name." Robert's mouth flattened. Virginia continued before he could speak. "I said I wished somebody would make you understand you didn't belong among people who had lived here all their lives." Martha felt something cold settle behind her ribs. "You didn't tell her to ruin the dress?" "No." "Did you tell her to hurt me?" Virginia shook her head quickly. "No." "Did you tell her to frighten me?" "No." Martha watched her. Virginia held her gaze. "I wanted you embarrassed. That's the truth." She looked toward the stove. "I am not proud of it. That doesn't undo it." "I know." Silence pressed across the table. Robert said nothing. Martha appreciated that. Virginia had come to speak to her, not to him. Martha folded her hands. "What happened at the supper?" Virginia's eyes lowered. "Louise disappeared for maybe 15 minutes. "When?" "After I spoke to Robert." Martha remembered Virginia's hand around the cider glass, the way she had walked away. Virginia continued. "I was angry. I went looking for my father because I wanted to leave. Louise said she needed air. And then? She came back through the side passage. Martha's attention sharpened. Which side? The cloakroom side. Robert straightened away from the stove. Virginia saw it. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. What changed? Virginia hesitated. When she came back, she had a dark mark on her cuff. Martha leaned forward. Black? Very dark brown, maybe black. Which cuff, right? Virginia touched the outside of her own wrist. Here, Robert asked. Did you ask her about it? No. Why not? Because I didn't care. Virginia's voice cracked slightly on the last word. She looked at Martha again. That is the part I wish I could make sound better. Martha said nothing. Virginia looked back down. I heard people laughing. Then I saw you, and I knew something had happened. You suspected Louise? Not then. When? This morning. Martha frowned. Virginia reached into her coat pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. It was a receipt. Martha opened it. Hale Mercantile. 2 bottles lamp oil. 1 sack coffee. 3 pounds sugar. 1 small tin leather dressing. The date was 3 days before the harvest supper. Martha looked up. What am I supposed to see? Look at the handwriting at the bottom. A notation had been added in a smaller hand. Delivered by L. Carter. Robert came closer. Virginia said, Louise handles some of my father's orders now. Correspondence, receipts, small accounts, things my father doesn't want to bother with. Martha looked at the writing again. Neat, narrow, controlled. What does that have to do with the dress? Nothing yet. Virginia folded her glove. But when Sheriff Dalton asked me about Parker's shop yesterday, I remembered Louise asking where you worked. Martha's eyes narrowed. When? The morning before the supper. Robert looked at Martha. Virginia continued. She asked if Parker kept expensive leather in the back. Said she needed to know where to send one of Father's men if they needed repairs. Did she mention shears? No. Stain? No. Virginia took a breath, but she knew the room. Martha sat back. The evidence was thin. Too thin. Yet something about it bothered her. Not because Virginia wanted it to be true, because Virginia clearly did not want to be sitting there at all. Martha asked, Why tell me now? Virginia's face stiffened. Because Sheriff Dalton told my father about the wagon. Robert's eyes hardened. He told Albert? He had to. Hale men had been at Stone Ridge. Virginia nodded toward the window. My father thinks somebody is trying to hurt his business dealings with you. And you? Virginia looked at Martha. I think ruining a dress is one kind of cruelty. She paused. Cutting harness on a loaded wagon is another. That was the first thing she had said that Martha trusted without reservation. Virginia stood. I don't know what Louise did. She pulled her glove back on. But I know what I did. Martha remained seated. Virginia's hand tightened on the chair. I was cruel to you, yes. I wanted you ashamed. Yes. Virginia looked toward Robert, then back to Martha. I can't change that. No. Virginia waited as if hoping for something else. Forgiveness, perhaps. Martha did not give it. Finally, Virginia nodded. Fair enough. She turned toward the door. Martha spoke. Virginia. She stopped. If Louise did this, don't confront her. Virginia looked back. Why? Because if she's willing to cut harness, we don't know what else she's willing to do. That seemed to reach her. Virginia nodded once, then left. Sheriff Dalton mounted with her several minutes later and rode east toward Dry Creek. Robert stood on the porch watching until they disappeared over the rise. Martha joined him. Wind pushed cold against the house. "Do you believe her?" he asked. "About the dress? About Louise?" Martha folded her arms against the chill. "I believe Virginia knows the difference between wanting me humiliated and wanting 3 men hurt." Robert's eyes remained on the road. "That's not much of a compliment. It wasn't meant to be." He looked down at her. Martha turned toward the house. "Let's check the ledger again." Rain began before sundown. Not a gentle autumn shower. A hard mountain rain driven sideways by wind. Martha was still at Stone Ridge when Peter returned from checking the east road. He entered the kitchen dripping water across the floor. "Creek's up." Robert looked up from the table. "How bad?" "Bridge crossing's still there, but the approach is underwater." Martha stood. "I should leave now." Robert shook his head. "No. If I wait, you'll wait until morning. I've ridden in rain. This isn't rain." Thunder rolled across the ridge. Peter removed his hat. Roads already washing near the lower cottonwoods. Martha looked toward the window. Darkness had come early. Water streamed down the glass. She thought of Susan Bell expecting her, then of the creek. Robert said, "Peter can ride into town at first light if the crossing holds. He'll tell Susan where you are." Martha hesitated. The old gossip returned immediately. "Woman stays overnight at Stone Ridge." Robert Langley's house. Virginia's words. The barn. The dress. Robert saw something change in her face. "You'll have your own room." Martha looked at him. He continued carefully. "My sisters." She had never heard him mention a sister. "There's clean bedding. Door locks from inside." "Robert, I wasn't suggesting." "I know." His voice softened. "I just don't want you wondering." That silenced her. He did not tell her not to care what people said. He understood that the price of gossip never fell equally. Martha slowly sat again. "All right." Robert nodded. Nothing more. After supper, he carried a lamp upstairs. Martha followed him down a narrow hall. The room at the end was small and simple. A brass bed, a washstand, a cedar chest. Blue curtains faded nearly gray by years of sun. On the wall hung a tiny framed drawing of wildflowers. Robert set the lamp down. "My sister Mary used this room when she visited." Martha touched the bedpost lightly. "Younger?" 7 years. "Where is she now?" Robert went still. Martha regretted the question immediately. "You don't have to answer. She died." His hand rested on the back of the chair. 12 years ago. "I'm sorry." Robert nodded once. "Sheets are clean." He turned toward the door. "Where will you sleep?" "Bunkhouse." Martha looked at him. "In this weather?" "Roof doesn't leak. You have your own room here." "Yes." "Then why?" He stopped in the doorway. Rain hammered against the roof. "You never have to be afraid of owing me anything." Martha said nothing. Robert met her eyes for one quiet second, then stepped into the hall. "Good night, Martha. Good night." She watched him cross the yard from the upstairs window several minutes later. His coat was dark with rain before he reached the bunkhouse. He never looked back at the house. Martha rested one hand against the window frame. For years, she had known men who offered kindness with a price hidden behind it. Robert had just left his own warm house, so she would never have to wonder whether his kindness came with one. That frightened her more than Virginia's jealousy, more than Dry Creek's gossip. Because distrust had always been easy, trust was beginning to ask something from her. And down in Dry Creek, while rain beat against Hale Mercantile's windows, Louise Carter sat alone at Albert Hale's account desk, staring at a page of figures she had already changed once. By morning, the storm had passed. The road to Dry Creek remained too soft for a loaded wagon. But Peter Wallace found the creek crossing low enough to ride through and carried word to Susan Bell that Martha was safe at Stone Ridge. Martha spent the morning in Robert's kitchen with 3 ledgers spread across the table. One belonged to Stone Ridge. One was a bundle of freight receipts George Parker had sent over. The third consisted of copies of cattle purchase statements from Albert Hale's office. Robert stood near the stove drinking coffee from the same chipped tin mug he used every morning. "You've been looking at the same page for 10 minutes. Martha did not answer. She turned one receipt sideways, then another. Robert waited. That had become one of the things she valued most about him. He did not fill silence simply because silence existed. Martha ran a finger down a column. "How many steers did Hale buy from you in August? 240? Not 253? Robert set down his mug. "No." Martha turned the ledger toward him. Stone Ridge's book showed 240 head. The Hale statement showed 253. Robert frowned. 13 head difference. At $21 each, he calculated silently. $273. Martha nodded. "Now look at the freight." She placed another receipt beside it. "Charges for 3 wagons. Stone Ridge had used 2. Another discrepancy. Then another. Small enough to disappear inside a large cattle operation. Large enough to matter over time. Robert pulled out the chair beside her and sat. Could be sloppy bookkeeping. Once. She slid a second paper forward. Twice, maybe. A third. But not this many times. Robert studied the handwriting. Most entries were in Albert Hale's broad, uneven hand. The corrections were different. Narrow numbers, sharp 7s. The tail of each 9 hooked inward. Martha opened the receipt Virginia had brought the day before. Delivered by L. Carter. Same hand. Robert's expression changed. "Louise. Maybe. You just showed me her handwriting. I showed you handwriting that appears to match." Robert looked at her. "That's the same thing. Not if we're going to accuse someone of theft." He leaned back. Martha placed the papers in order. "Look at the dates." The earliest questionable entry was from the previous winter. Then another in April. 2 in June. 3 during late summer. A pattern. Not large thefts. Careful thefts. Enough to disappear inside cattle counts, freight charges, and supply purchases. Robert rubbed his thumb over the edge of the table. Albert knows. If he does, he's hiding it strangely. Martha flipped another page. These corrections increase what Hale's business supposedly paid out, but the Stone Ridge side doesn't show receiving the extra money. Meaning? Meaning the difference went somewhere else. Robert looked toward the rain-washed window. Louise's husband died owing money. Martha paused. "You knew him?" "Not well. Thomas Carter. Tried farming east of town, then cattle. Bad luck and worse judgment." "How bad?" "Enough that creditors sold most of what Louise had after he died." Martha sat back. That gave motive, not proof. Robert reached for the ledger again. "If she's been taking from Albert, why come after me?" Because these numbers touch your ranch. Martha tapped the page. If you compared your books with Hale's, someone would eventually notice. Until now, I didn't. No. Robert's mouth tightened. And then you came. Martha looked up. The kitchen seemed quieter. Robert said it again, more carefully. You came in, fixed the repair ledger, started matching purchases against receipts. Martha's eyes moved slowly back to the page. And suddenly someone ruined my dress. Robert stood. The chair sewn scraped hard against the floor. She wanted you gone. Maybe. Then she cut the harness when you didn't leave. Maybe. Robert looked impatient now. You keep saying maybe, because facts matter. And so does not getting killed by a wagon. Martha met his eyes. Which is why we do this correctly. That stopped him. She gathered the questionable receipts. Virginia wanted me embarrassed because she thought I was getting too close to you. Robert's gaze stayed on her. Martha continued before either of them had to deal with that sentence. Louise knew Virginia was angry. She had access to Hale's business. She knew I worked at Parker's. If she wanted me gone, ruining the dress was easy. And when it didn't work, she realized I was spending even more time at Stone Ridge. Robert looked toward the papers. Where you were fixing my books. Exactly. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Peter came through the back door carrying split firewood. He saw the table. Bad news? Robert answered. Get Dalton. Peter dropped the wood beside the stove. Now? Now. Martha spoke. And Albert Hale. Robert looked at her. If we're right, he needs to see his own accounts before Louise knows we're looking. Peter nodded and reached for his coat. By afternoon, Sheriff Dalton and Albert Hale were both at Stone Ridge. Albert arrived in a mud-spattered carriage, furious at the road, and confused about why Robert had summoned him so urgently. He was 56, heavy through the middle, with silver beginning at his temples. Martha had never seen him without Virginia nearby. He looked older alone. Dalton shut the kitchen door. Martha laid out the papers. She explained every discrepancy. Slowly. No accusations. No conclusions. Only numbers. Albert's irritation faded after the third receipt. By the sixth, he was standing. That's impossible. Martha kept her voice even. Do you recognize the corrections? Albert picked up one sheet. His hand shook slightly. Louise sometimes prepares statements for me. Does she handle payments? Small ones. Bank drafts? Some. Dalton leaned against the table. How much access? Albert looked at him. Enough. The single word changed everything. Martha pointed to another entry. This freight payment was increased by $48. Albert took the receipt. I never approved that. And this cattle count? No. He sat heavily. Robert remained near the stove, arms folded. Albert looked at him. You think Louise has been stealing from me? Robert answered. I think Martha found money missing. Albert glanced toward her. For perhaps the first time since Martha had arrived in Dry Creek, a man connected to the town's most influential family looked at her as though what she knew might matter more than who she was. How long? Martha slid the earliest receipt forward. At least since January. Albert closed his eyes briefly. Dalton asked, Where's Louise now? Dry Creek. Where exactly? My office, usually. Albert suddenly looked up. She keeps the correspondence cabinet key. Dalton straightened. We go now. Robert reached for his coat. Martha did too. He looked at her. You stay. No. Martha. The papers are in my order. We can carry paper. You won't know what you're looking for. Robert stared at her. Martha stared back. Dalton opened the door. Argue on horseback. They rode into Dry Creek under a low gray sky. The rain had left the road slick, and their horses picked carefully around standing water near the cottonwoods. By the time they reached Hale Mercantile, evening light had begun fading. Virginia stood outside the office entrance. She looked from her father to Dalton, then to Martha. What's happened? Albert got down from the carriage. Where is Louise? Virginia's face changed. I thought she was with you. No. She left after breakfast. Dalton stepped forward. Where? She said she was going to the bank. Albert swore. They entered the office. The account desk stood open. One drawer had been pulled out. Another was locked. Albert reached for the correspondence cabinet. The key was gone. Martha crossed to the desk. A fresh sheet of blotting paper lay over the writing surface. She lifted it. Beneath it was the faint impression of recently written figures, not enough to read clearly. She angled the paper toward the lamp. Robert came beside her. What? She was working here last night. Virginia stood in the doorway. I saw the lamp. Everyone turned. Virginia swallowed. After the storm started, I passed on my way home. Louise was still inside. Albert looked at his daughter. Why didn't you say anything? Because she often works late. Martha's eyes went to the cabinet. Do you have another key? Albert nodded. At home. Dalton said, Get it. They waited 20 minutes. When Albert returned, his hands were shaking hard enough that Robert finally took the key from him. The cabinet opened. Letters, invoices, canceled notes, receipts tied with string. One shelf had been cleared. Martha noticed it immediately. Something's missing. Albert stared. The old cattle statements. How many? Months. Dalton's face hardened. Then hoofbeats sounded outside. Fast. Peter Wallace appeared in the doorway, breathing hard. Robert stepped toward him. What is it? Peter looked at Martha first, then Robert. Stone Ridge. Robert's expression sharpened. What about it? Peter swallowed. Smoke. Silence. From where? The tack building. Robert was already moving. Martha grabbed the ledger bundle. Dalton called after them. Wait. Robert didn't. They reached the street at a run. Peter caught Robert's arm before he mounted. Boss. Robert turned. Peter's face was gray. It wasn't chimney smoke. The town seemed to disappear around Martha. The missing statements, the sabotaged harness. Louise gone. And now the one building holding Stone Ridge's repair records, winter tack, and the blue dress Martha had left there while deciding whether it could ever be repaired was burning. Robert swung into the saddle. Martha mounted beside him. This time neither of them needed to say what they were both thinking. Someone was not merely hiding a theft anymore. Someone was trying to burn the truth before they could reach it. The ride back to Stone Ridge felt twice as long as the ride into town. Robert pushed his horse hard, but not recklessly. The road was still wet from the storm, and mud sucked at the animals' hooves whenever they dropped into the deeper wagon ruts. Martha stayed close behind him. Peter rode ahead. Sheriff Dalton followed with one deputy. By the time Stone Ridge came into view, smoke was rolling low across the yard. The tack building burned at the rear corner. Not a roaring wall of flame. Worse in some ways. A deep, stubborn fire chewing through dry timber, leather oil, canvas, and stored tack. Ranch hands had already formed a bucket line from the stock tank. Robert jumped from the saddle before his horse fully stopped. "Keep it off the barn!" men shouted back. Water splashed across blackened boards. A section of roof sagged inward. Martha dismounted and started toward the building. Robert turned. "No. My tools are in there. So are mine. The ledgers. We've got copies. The dress." That stopped him. Only for a second. Then Robert's jaw tightened. "You are not going inside." Martha looked past him. Smoke poured from the front doorway. He was right. She hated that he was right. Robert grabbed a bucket and joined the line. Martha stood near the edge of the yard, hands clenched. The fire was distraction enough for everyone. Men running, horses nervous in the corral, smoke cutting visibility. Sheriff Dalton shouting questions no one had time to answer. Then Martha noticed something else. Hoof prints. Fresh ones. They crossed the muddy strip behind the tack building. One horse. Leaving. Martha stared at them. The prints came from the rear of the structure, not the ranch road. She looked toward the burning building, then toward the narrow service lane running behind the smokehouse. "Louise." No one heard her. Martha grabbed Robert's spare rifle from the saddle scabbard, not to use against anyone. She simply did not intend to follow a desperate person unarmed. She moved around the rear of the building. The tracks were clear in the wet ground. A horse had been waiting there. Martha followed, past the smokehouse, past the garden fence, toward the irrigation ditch that carried creek water along the lower pasture. The trail bent around a stand of cottonwoods. Then she saw movement. A woman on horseback. Dark coat. Gray skirt. Louise Carter. She was struggling with a leather valise tied behind the saddle. "Louise!" The woman jerked around. For one moment their eyes met. Louise's face went white. Then she kicked the horse forward. Martha ran. The ground sloped toward a narrow cattle gate crossing the irrigation cut. Louise's horse was already approaching it. Too fast. The gate had been tied open with a rope looped around a post, because ranch hands had been moving stock earlier that morning. Beyond it, the path narrowed between the ditch and a rough fence line. Martha stopped. She could not catch a horse on foot. She raised the rifle. Louise looked back and saw it. Her face twisted. "Don't!" Martha did not aim at her. She aimed at the rope holding the gate. The rifle cracked across the pasture. The rope snapped. The heavy gate swung inward. Louise yanked the reins. Her horse shied sideways and stopped short, blowing hard. Louise nearly lost her seat. The valise slid loose and struck the ground. Papers spilled into the mud. A metal object flashed among them. Leather shears. George Parker's leather shears. Martha lowered the rifle. "Get down." Louise stared at her. "You have no idea what you've done." "I have a fairly good idea." Louise's hand moved toward the reins. Martha raised the rifle again. "Not at Louise. Just enough." "Don't." Louise froze. Footsteps and hoofbeats sounded behind Martha. Robert came around the cottonwoods first. Dalton followed. Robert saw Martha, then Louise, then the rifle. His face changed in a way Martha had never seen before. Fear first, then relief, then anger. All of it gone almost immediately beneath control. Dalton rode forward. "Louise Carter." Louise said nothing. The sheriff dismounted. "Get off the horse." She hesitated. Robert took one step closer. Louise climbed down. Dalton gathered the scattered papers. Albert Hale's cattle statements, freight receipts, canceled payment notes, one small bottle wrapped in cloth, black harness stain. Dalton unwrapped it and looked at Martha. That yours, Parker's? Martha nodded. Same imported bottle. He picked up the shears next. Mud covered one handle. The lower blade still had a small, worn curve Martha recognized instantly. Louise saw her looking. You can't prove anything. Martha looked at the papers. The accounts prove theft, not the dress. The shears do. They're common shears. No. Martha stepped closer. Those are George's. Louise's mouth tightened. Dalton looked at the cut blade. Martha continued. The lower edge pulls left when it closes. That's why the dress cut curved. That's why the harness cuts did too. Louise looked toward Robert. Something bitter entered her face. This all happened because of her. Robert went completely still. Martha said, No. Louise turned on her. You came into town and suddenly everybody cared what you thought. Parker gave you his books. Langley gave you his. You started comparing things that weren't yours to compare. Martha held her gaze. They became my business when you tried to make a wagon fail. I never meant for anyone to die. Then what did you mean? Louise looked away. To delay the shipment. Robert spoke for the first time. By cutting harness. Enough to cause trouble. You didn't know what trouble would look like. Louise's eyes flicked toward him. No. Robert's voice remained low. You didn't care. That silenced her. Dalton stepped beside Louise. You're coming back to Dry Creek. She did not resist. The deputy took her horse. As Dalton tied the valise shut, Martha looked back toward Stone Ridge. Smoke still rose above the ranch. Robert followed her gaze. The fire. They hurried back. By then, the worst had been contained. The tack building still stood, though half the roof had burned away and one wall was blackened through. Wet leather lay scattered across the yard. Charred tack, broken shelves, canvas, boxes of buckles and rivets. Martha moved through the wreckage slowly. Robert stayed close but did not touch her. Peter came over. Soot streaked across his face. We got most of the saddles out. Martha nodded. The ledger copies? Kitchen. She looked toward the burned doorway. And the blue dress? Peter's eyes dropped. Martha understood before he spoke. I saw the trunk, he said quietly. After the roof caught. She walked around the side. Near the back wall sat the remains of the small wooden chest where she had stored the dress after bringing it from Susan's. The lid had burned through. Martha crouched. Robert stopped behind her. Inside, the dress was still partly there. Blue wool turned black at one side. Pearl-colored buttons cracked from heat. Much of the skirt soaked from bucket water and smoke. Martha lifted it carefully. The fabric sagged heavy in her hands. She found the hem, the original cut, then the old stitches. Some remained. Not all. Her mother's thread had survived one humiliation, not the fire entirely. Martha sat down on an overturned water trough beside the building. The dress lay across her lap. For the first time since Robert had known her, she did not immediately straighten her shoulders. He came over, sat beside her, not close enough to crowd, close enough to stay. The ranch slowly quieted around them. Men moved burned equipment. Someone led frightened horses back toward the barn. Dalton rode away with Louise under guard. Martha barely noticed. Robert looked at the dress, then at her hands. He did not say it was only cloth. He did not offer to buy another. He did not tell her she should be grateful she was safe. Those things were true. They were also useless. So he said nothing. Martha traced one blackened button with her thumb. My mother hated this color at first. Robert glanced at her. Blue? She said it was too dark. Martha managed a small breath that almost became a laugh. I argued with her for a week. Who won? I did. Good. Martha looked at the ruined wool. She changed her mind after she saw it cut. Robert waited. She told me it made me look like somebody who knew where she was going. The words nearly failed at the end. Martha swallowed. Robert's hand shifted once on his knee. He did not reach for her. She was grateful for that too. After a long while, Martha folded the burned portion inward. Robert watched. Can it be repaired? I don't know. He nodded. Martha ran her fingers along what remained of the hem. Then she thought of Louise, the barn, the laughter, the stain, the fire. Everything that had happened since she first dared to wear something beautiful. She folded the dress again, more carefully this time. She already ruined it once. Robert looked at her. Martha lifted her eyes. I'm not letting her ruin it twice. Something shifted in his face. Not pity, never pity. He stood and held out one large hand. Martha looked at it, then placed hers in his. Robert pulled her to her feet. He released her as soon as she was steady. No longer than needed. No less than needed. Martha carried the damaged dress toward the house. Robert walked beside her. Behind them, Stone Ridge smelled of wet ash and burned leather. Ahead, the first snow of the season had begun to collect high along the crazy mountains. Small white lines against dark stone. Winter coming. Martha looked down at the dress in her arms. It was stained, cut, burned, still hers. And for the first time she did not see something destroyed. She saw something waiting to be remade. Winter came down hard on Dry Creek. By the first week of December, snow lay along the boardwalk edges and packed white between wagon ruts. Smoke rose straight from chimneys in the still mornings. Horses stood under blankets outside the mercantile, and every door in town seemed to open onto the smell of coffee, damp wool, and wood smoke. Louise Carter remained in custody while Sheriff Dalton finished gathering statements and account papers. Albert Hale repaid the money missing from Stone Ridge's cattle transactions, before Robert ever asked. He came to the ranch himself with a leather packet of cash and signed receipts. Robert counted none of it in front of him. He simply handed the packet to Martha. You found the loss. Martha looked at him. It's your money. Still want you to check the figures. Albert Hale cleared his throat. Martha opened the packet. The amount matched. Exactly. Correct. Albert gave a tired nod. Before leaving, he removed his hat. Miss Bennett. Martha waited. My family treated you poorly. Robert's gaze shifted toward him. Albert corrected himself. Some of us worse than poorly. Martha folded the receipt. Yes. Albert looked as though he had expected something easier. Forgiveness, perhaps. She gave him truth instead. He nodded. I suppose that's fair. Virginia came to see Martha 3 days later. Not at Stone Ridge. At Susan Bell's boarding house. Martha had returned to Dry Creek for several days because Susan had agreed to help with the dress, and because some work could only be done beneath good lamplight at a sewing table rather than beside a ranch stove. Virginia stood in the kitchen doorway holding a small parcel. Susan looked at Martha. Martha nodded once. Susan left them alone. Virginia placed the parcel on the table. Blue wool. Martha's hands stopped over the damaged dress. She did not touch the package. Why, Helena, shipment came through yesterday. That isn't what I asked. Virginia looked down. I thought you might need it. Martha studied her. Virginia's face had lost some of its old polished certainty. I told Reverend Warren what I did, she said. Martha said nothing. I told him I mocked you, that I encouraged the talk, that Louise knew I wanted you embarrassed. Why? Because people were still saying you caused all of this. Virginia's mouth tightened. They said Louise only became desperate because you interfered in Hale business, that Robert brought trouble on himself by keeping you around. Martha looked down at the scorched cloth. And you corrected them? Yes. Publicly? Virginia nodded. At church. That surprised Martha. Virginia noticed. I didn't do it for you to forgive me. Good. A faint, embarrassed breath escaped Virginia. No. I suppose that would be asking too much. Martha finally opened the parcel. The wool was close, not identical, a shade brighter than the original. She laid it beside the damaged skirt. The difference was obvious. Virginia frowned. It's not the same. No. I can send for another. Martha shook her head. This will do. Virginia looked at her. Martha touched the old fabric, then the new. It doesn't have to match perfectly. Virginia stood there another moment, then quietly left. Susan returned carrying 2 coffee mugs. Well? Martha picked up the new wool. She brought this. Susan examined it. Good cloth. Too bright. Then we'll use it. Martha smiled. That's what I said. They spent most of January rebuilding the dress, not restoring it. That word never felt right. Too much had happened. Susan removed the worst burned sections. Martha replaced one side panel completely. They kept the small pearl-colored buttons that had survived the fire and replaced the cracked ones with plain bone where necessary. The original stain could not be removed from one narrow strip near the hem. Susan offered to cut it away. Martha stopped her. No. Susan looked up. Leave that part. People will see it. I know. They stitched it inside the repaired hem, beside the surviving thread Martha's mother had sewn years before. Old blue, new blue, one dark stain, 3 kinds of stitches. Nothing matched perfectly anymore. Martha liked it better that way. The midwinter gathering was announced for the 2nd Saturday in February. Same barn, same town, same long plank tables. Martha almost laughed when Susan told her. You expect me to go back there? Susan stirred sugar into her coffee. I expect you to decide. That was different. Martha looked toward the dress hanging beside the stove. She thought about Robert. Stone Ridge. Coffee left beside her work. A lantern moved closer without comment. His coat around her shoulders. His hand offered beside the burned tack shed. Not once had he asked her to become smaller so he could stand beside her comfortably. I'll go, Susan nodded as if she had expected nothing else. Saturday evening came with light snow. Martha rode into Dry Creek in Robert's wagon, though he sat on the opposite side of the seat, with enough room between them for propriety and winter blankets. He wore the same black coat from the harvest supper. She wore the blue dress. Robert had already seen it that afternoon at Stone Ridge, or almost seen it. Martha had come down the stairs, fastening one cuff, and found him standing near the front door. He looked up, stopped. Just as he had months earlier at Susan's boarding house. Martha waited. Robert removed his hat. Again. Well? He looked at the repaired skirt, at the brighter blue panel, at the faint dark mark near the hem. Then at her. Don't change it. Martha smiled. You said that once before. I was right then, too. Now, as they reached the barn, Robert climbed down first. He offered his hand. Martha looked at it, then placed hers in his. The gesture lasted only long enough for her boots to reach the ground. Inside, fiddle music floated beneath the rafters. People turned when they entered. Martha felt it. The old instinct came back immediately, shoulders tightening, breath shortening. Then she looked down at the dress. The stain remained. Small, visible if someone searched for it. She did not cover it. Reverend Warren approached first. "Miss Bennett." "Martha," she corrected. His eyes warmed. "Martha." George Parker waved from the food table. Peter Wallace lifted his coffee mug. Susan Bell stood near the stove wearing an expression that dared anyone to behave badly. Even Sheriff Dalton was there, speaking with Albert Hale near the wall. Virginia stood beside her father. Their eyes met. Virginia gave one small nod. Martha returned it. Nothing more was needed. Robert started toward the same Stone Ridge table where they had sat months before. Then he stopped. The fiddle changed tune. Couples began moving toward the open floor. Robert looked at Martha. She knew something was wrong immediately. He was nervous. Robert Langley, who could handle a frightened horse, an angry buyer, a burned building, and a sabotaged wagon without changing his voice, suddenly seemed uncertain what to do with his hands. Martha waited. He cleared his throat. "Dance with me." She stared at him. "You said you don't dance." "I said I don't dance well." "That's different?" "Very." Martha looked around. Everyone seemed to be watching. She lowered her voice. "Robert." "What?" "Everyone's watching." His eyes moved briefly across the barn, then back to her. "They've been watching since the day you came here." Martha's mouth twitched. Robert held out his hand. "Might as well give them something worth remembering." She laughed, not quietly, and put her hand in his. Robert was right about one thing. He was not a good dancer. His steps were too large. His timing was slightly late. Once he nearly stepped on Martha's skirt and muttered an apology so serious she laughed again. But his hand at hers was careful. His other rested lightly at her back. No pulling, no claiming, only contact. Martha forgot the room after a while, forgot Virginia, forgot the laughter from months before, forgot the moment she had stood behind that partition with black stain running down blue wool. When the song ended, Robert did not release her immediately. His thumb moved once against her fingers, then stopped. Martha looked up. "He let go, eh?" She nodded. They stepped outside. Snow fell softly across Dry Creek. Lantern light spilled through the barn doors behind them, turning the nearest flakes gold before they disappeared into darkness. Robert stood beside the hitching rail. For once, he did not seem to know where to look. Martha waited. Finally, he said, "That night." "The supper?" "Yes." He looked toward the barn. "I stood beside you because what they did was wrong." Martha said nothing. Robert took a slow breath. "But that's not why I'm standing here now." She looked at him. Snow caught in his dark hair. His enormous hands hung at his sides, empty, uncertain. "You don't need me to save you, Martha." Her throat tightened. "I know." "Good." He looked down, then back at her. "That's not what I'm asking." Martha did not move. Robert stepped closer. Not enough to crowd her. Enough that she could see how carefully he was holding himself still. One of his hands opened. Martha placed hers in it. His fingers closed around hers with extraordinary gentleness. "I'm asking if you'll let me love you." The words hung between them. Simple. No audience needed. No promise of rescue. No bargain. Martha looked through the open barn doors. People moved beneath lantern light. Some of those people had laughed at her. Some had stayed silent. Some had changed. Some had not. Then she looked down at the dress, the repaired panel, the uneven buttons, the faint dark mark near the hem. She could have hidden it. She had chosen not to. Martha lifted her eyes to Robert. Yes. Nothing dramatic happened. No cheering. No music swelling at the exact right moment. Robert simply exhaled. His forehead lowered until it nearly touched hers. He stopped before it did. Waiting. Martha closed the last inch herself. Months later, when the spring thaw loosened the road between Stone Ridge and Dry Creek, Robert asked Martha to marry him. Not in town. Not before Reverend Warren. Not where anybody could watch. They were standing beside the Stone Ridge tack room, rebuilt after the fire. Martha was checking a new set of harness when Robert walked in carrying 2 coffee mugs. He set hers beside her, then remained standing. Martha looked up. You forgot something? Probably. He took a breath. Martha. She waited. He reached into his coat and held out a plain silver ring. No speech, no practical arrangement, no mention of gossip. I'd like you to stay. Martha looked toward the ranch yard. Peter was repairing fence near the corral. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Her account ledger lay open on the bench. A blue curtain now hung in the upstairs room Robert had once given her during the storm. She looked back at him. For how long? Robert understood. His expression softened. As long as we've got, Martha held out her hand. Years later, the blue dress rested inside a cedar chest upstairs at Stone Ridge. Martha never threw it away. Beside her mother's original stitching were the newer stitches she and Susan had added. Some thread was darker. Some cloth did not match. One faint stain remained where no washing had ever removed it. But the dress was whole. Downstairs, Robert called her name. Martha? She closed the cedar chest. There had been a time when hearing someone call for her that made her wonder what work needed doing, what mistake had been found, or what room she was expected to leave. Not anymore. Martha crossed the room, opened the door, and went downstairs to him. And maybe that was the quietest victory of all. Imagine standing where Martha once stood, holding the one beautiful thing your mother helped you make while strangers laughed at what they had ruined. Imagine having every reason to disappear, yet choosing to sit back down. Then imagine discovering that the person beside you wasn't there because he thought you were helpless. He was there because he saw your worth before the rest of the room learned how badly it had misjudged you. Robert never gave Martha her dignity. It had always belonged to her. What he gave her was something different, a love that didn't ask her to shrink, apologize, or become someone easier for other people to accept. And Martha gave him something too. She showed a man who had spent years building fences around his life that loving someone wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was simply opening the gate and trusting that the right person would stay. The blue dress was never perfect again. Neither were the people who wore their scars beneath it and beside it. Maybe that's why it mattered. If you had been Martha that night in the barn, would you have stayed or walked away? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about wounded hearts, second chances, and unexpected love still mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us. There are many more stories waiting down the trail.